The sheriff's office got no response. They sent a car, and her parents were tied up in the safe house. Karen, Patrick, Mark, and the deputies were missing. The ranger isn't answering either. You want my guess? The ranger, the deputies, and maybe more were involved, and my family is being kept as a bargaining chip against exposing the crooked people in Austin who have been allowing this all along, as well as being involved in getting paid. They think they can escape the law, and maybe they can, but they're not safe from consequences. With that, Tim called his friend Will in New Braunfels. He gave a quick summary and mentioned he would need support. Will said he would inform Los Ratones in the area, and they would be ready to help. Jeannie was nervously wringing her hands while Joe packed his things and told Jeannie to do the same. She hugged Tim tightly and then hurried to the bedroom. Tim called Deputy Jackson. It took a little while for him to get to a private phone to call back. Tim shared his story and asked for help. Jackson said he would take a couple of days off after his shift ended that afternoon and would spend the day gathering information. Nate arrived early, and 3 cars followed him closely. Everyone he asked for was there, but Sheriff Rodriguez was also present. Tim looked at Nate and then at the sheriff. "You probably don't want to be here, Sheriff," he said. Miguel glanced behind him, frowned, and said, "I don't see a sheriff here. I'm with my friends for the fishing tournament." Tim waved Miguel over and they embraced. "Those wrenches can't do anything right," Tim said firmly. They entered the cabin, grabbed the coffee cups Jeannie had prepared, and sat around the table. "Where are Los Angeles?" Tim asked, looking concerned. "Secured off-site, just in case. Let's discuss this a little, and then we can ask for their help," Nate replied calmly. "Let me start," Miguel said. "I've been on the phone all morning and learned some things that might help." He shared what he had found out from different sources, including Jim Boyd. Turning to Tim, he added, "I should mention that Jim Boyd is feeling pretty ashamed. He's taking time off and coming down for the fishing tournament himself. Anyone can go fishing, but everyone needs to understand the rules. If they can't follow those rules, they need to stay away." "What are the rules, Hermano?" Nate asked. "My family survives, everyone else doesn't. No mercy." They exchanged looks around the table, and everyone nodded slightly. "That sounds like a solid plan. I'd like to suggest a little addition. Your family survives, the bad guys don't, and we all go back home happily. How does that sound?" Tim smiled genuinely. "Thanks. I forgot to include that. It's been part of every other plan, and it should be part of this one, too. Now can we go ask for their help?" Joe stepped over, shook Tim's hand quickly, hugged him tightly, and said he would ensure Jeannie was safe, but he would be available if needed. Jeannie was calm, but her lip trembled. She kissed him as if it was their last, and then walked to her dad's truck with her suitcase and bag. The off-site location turned out to be where they had buried the others. 3 triangular hoists had been set up, each holding someone over a small fire. A pile of mesquite branches lay nearby. Chivo walked over to the 3 men, smiled, and showed them his Bowie knife. "Which one do I pick? You can't cook all 3. I want some fun, too." 30 minutes later, they had gathered everything they needed. "The drug cartels keep their information separate, but these guys are too foolish and overconfident," Miguel said. "Maybe they think we won't come after them on Lake Travis, which could be a big mistake, but perhaps they really are that clueless. They think the big bosses will protect them like before," Nate added. "These guys are definitely foolish, but are the ones protecting them really this silly, or are we walking into a trap?" "I don't care either way," Tim said firmly. "I'm going after them, and anyone in the way is going to pay." They buried the remains in a pit using a backhoe, then replanted trees and bushes over the spot, placing stones around it haphazardly. There was no sign of a dig or what was buried, but Daniel promised to make it look nicer when he had the time. By morning, it would blend in with the rest of the land. Back at the house, Miguel called Boyd on his private line. They talked for a few minutes, sharing news and information, and then Miguel handed the phone to Tim. Boyd tried to apologize again, but Kelly interrupted him and said nothing would be forgiven until his family was safe. "If you really plan to help, talk to Randy Jackson. My friend Will is coming up with a few others from New Braunfels, and you can all go to the fishing tournament together. I'll give you his number soon, but Jim, let me warn you, if anyone gets in my way, or if anyone is working against us, I promise you they will deeply regret it." He returned the phone to Miguel, and the officers continued to talk. Tim and the others began their final preparations. By 3:30, they had everything packed and ready. They made a few changes to their plan based on new information and left at 3:55 p.m. About 30 miles later, they passed a military convoy heading to drills, and Nate wondered out loud which group was better equipped. They met up on a ranch near Henley, west of Dripping Springs. The owner lived in Houston, and the ranch hand was Daniel Mendez Jr. Boyd updated them that Gomez, the leader of the Devil's Angels, was in charge of security at a lake house near Spicewood. He was there with 10 men, along with Karen and her sons, plus at least 5 other women, 2 of whom came with the Assistant Attorney General and the Railroad Commissioner. He didn't know who the other 3 were, but 2 high school seniors had been reported missing 2 days ago and were thought to have run away. Randy Jackson was scouting, and he would update everyone when they gathered near the lake house owned by the Railroad Commissioner. The group dressed in camouflage and boots, with black smudges on their faces. They had 2 sniper rifles with silencers, some AR rifles with silencers, 2 automatic shotguns, a bazooka, and a grenade launcher. They planned to use the last 3 only if things went wrong, but they were prepared just in case. They met Jackson on a dirt road in a valley about a mile from the large lake house. Jackson had experience as a Marine sniper, and Miguel was his Army partner, so they would lead this mission. After Jackson explained the plan, they made a few changes and parked the 2 vans in the bushes, away from the road. They got into the pickup quietly and drove toward the house with the lights off. It was dark, but the road was clear enough to see with limestone paving and white rocks along the edges. Jackson dropped off 2 groups of 3 at spots he had chosen. They would circle around to the sides of the house. The rest of the team continued without headlights about a quarter-mile up the hill, where they turned onto a dirt road and parked the truck. Miguel went to the right with 1 sniper rifle, while Randy Jackson went to the left with the other. They aimed to cover a wide area together. The distance was easy, but they wanted to take out as many targets as possible at the start, so careful timing was very important. Tim, Nate, and the 2 Mendez brothers quietly climbed the hill, spread out, and used binoculars to find the people inside the house. The 8 guards outside were easy to see. They were carrying rifles but seemed careless, wandering around the backyard and chatting with each other. Jackson and Miguel, each with a sniper rifle, had overlapping fields of fire. Their shots would signal the others to move from the bushes toward the house. The main attack would come from the front as well as from the right and left. The snipers would wait a few moments to provide cover before the other 10 men entered the house, which was perched on cliffs above the lake, with no way to escape on the east side. 2 guards were talking on the southwest corner, and 2 more were on the northwest corner when each sniper fired twice. They heard a soft poof from both sides. One was the sound of the shot being fired, and the other was the sound of the bullet hitting the target. The 4 guards fell to the ground silently. The remaining guards were casually patrolling the area when they, too, were taken down quietly. 3 teams moved swiftly across the open field, approaching the house from different directions. They quickly checked the guards and then advanced toward the house's patio, moving along the walls. Carefully, they peered through the windows, using hand signals to communicate the number of people they could see inside. There were 6 people in the living room on the first floor, 2 women and 4 men, all gathered near the bar. Tim, Jesse, and Jim Boyd's teams quietly entered from different sides of the house. Tim led his group through the front door, while Jesse's team entered from the south, and Jim's team came from the patio side. Once inside, Tim signaled Jim's team to watch the stairwell while his group moved closer to the bar. They closed in behind the 4 men, and Jesse's team positioned themselves near the 2 women. 6 silenced weapons were raised. The men saw Jesse's team approach, and the women spotted Tim's. Tim spoke quietly but with authority. "If you make any noise or try anything, you won't live to regret it. Do you understand?" They nodded in fear. Tim continued, "I'm here for my wife and 2 sons. Where are they?" There was a tense silence. Tim drew a short blade from the sheath on his back and placed it against the neck of one of the men. "You have 10 seconds to answer, or you'll never speak again. 10, 9, 8. One man quickly rasped, "Upstairs! They're upstairs!" Tim pressed further. Where upstairs exactly? Another man, glancing at Tim with disdain, spoke up. Kelly, I should have known it was you. You're in way over your head. Let us go and we'll give you the kids. But we're keeping your wife. Not that you care, right? Tim recognized the voice. Well, if it isn't the ex-sheriff, fancy meeting you here. So tell me, why am I in over my head? It seems like we're the ones in control. The sheriff sneered. You have no idea who you're dealing with. If you survive tonight, and that's a big if, we'll hunt you down. Then we'll come for everyone you care about. We're more powerful than you can imagine, and we don't show mercy. Without a word, Tim swiftly acted, cutting the throat of the man in front of him. In a single motion, he struck the ex-sheriff, knocking him to the ground with a heavy blow that shattered his jaw. The sheriff collapsed, blood spilling from his mouth, fear filling his eyes. Tim stood over him and delivered the final strike, ending it. Not tonight, Sheriff, Tim muttered. Turning back to the others, he leveled his gaze at one of the women. His voice calm but serious, he said, Tell me what I need to know, or you'll join them. Tim continued his countdown. 9, 8. When one of the women dropped to her knees, her voice shaking. Please don't hurt me. The boys are locked in a small bedroom upstairs, all the way down the hall to the left. The blonde woman and 2 girls are in the big bedroom across the hall, the one with the glass wall overlooking the lake. Tim shifted his attention to the second woman. How many men? He asked. She quickly answered, I think there are 6, but it could be more, maybe 9. I saw the Gomez brothers and General Spieth go upstairs with some men I didn't recognize, but I've been downstairs most of the night. She pointed at the man beside Tim. Commissioner Landon knows more. Tim turned to the commissioner, touching the tip of his sword to the man's nose. Commissioner? Landon, attempting to maintain some control, responded, We need to negotiate something here. But Tim quickly cut him off, pressing the sword into his nose, leaving it bleeding. No negotiations. Tell me, or else. The commissioner grabbed his nose, about to shout, but Daniel, one of Tim's men, quickly knocked him out with the butt of his rifle. The commissioner collapsed, leaving Tim to face the last man, who remained calm. Your turn, Tim said, watching him closely. The man, unfazed, replied, There are 2 guards with AKs and 8 others upstairs. Among them are the Assistant Attorney General, a Texas Ranger, a Deputy Sheriff, and a cartel leader. You might want to reconsider if you plan on getting your family out alive. Tim, unimpressed, mockingly replied, Oh no, not the Devil's Angels cartel. He narrowed his eyes. Are the Gomez brothers up there too? The man nodded. Yes, both Manuel and his brother. The women upstairs have stopped making noise, so who knows if they're still alive. But you should be more concerned about Spieth. He's worse than the rest. And who are you? Tim asked, his tone serious. The man stared straight ahead. Someone you don't want to mess with? Tim nodded toward Daniel, who fired without hesitation, ending the conversation. I guess I won't, Tim said as the man fell. Tim turned back to the women, his voice stern but calm. Now, you've seen what happens. Commissioner Landon might live a little longer because he still has some explaining to do about this whole operation, but you 2 will stay quiet. We'll deal with the situation upstairs. If we hear anything from you, it won't end well. Just then, Miguel and Randy entered, alert and ready, each holding an automatic shotgun. Tim nodded, signaling them that the real challenge lay ahead as they prepared to face the men upstairs. Jesse quickly brought the team up to speed, and they all moved together up the stairs. No guards were in sight as they approached the hallway, but voices could be heard coming from the bedroom on the right. Tim nodded to Chivo, who took the lead, holding throwing knives in each hand. The others spread out, taking positions at doorways on either side. As Chivo approached the 2 men near the open door, he called out, Vatos! Que paso? Startled, the guards stepped back, pulling the door partially closed and raising their weapons. Who are you? One of them demanded. Without hesitation, Chivo threw both knives, each striking a guard in the throat. The men dropped to the carpet, their rifles falling silently on the thick floor. Tim and his crew quickly moved to the doorway, listening for any signs of alarm inside the room, but the voices continued without change. They dragged the guards out of the way and took their positions by the door. Tim motioned with his hand, signaling Nate and Daniel Jr. to follow him as they headed down the hall to check on his sons. Entering the room, they found the boys asleep together on a large bed. Tim sighed in relief and quietly backed out, instructing Nate and Daniel to watch over them. "We've got them," Nate assured him, locking the door behind them. Back at the master bedroom, Miguel and Randy stood ready at the door, shotguns in hand, waiting for Tim's signal. He carefully opened the door just enough to peek inside. The scene was horrific. Katie lay on a large bed in the center, motionless and pale, while two young women on either side of her were sobbing. The women were being held by men with knives pressed against their faces. Katie was being hurt by a small man, her head pulled back unnaturally, and she seemed eerily still. Across the room, the Gomez brothers stood by the window, talking casually in Spanish as they watched the terrible scene. Two other men stood by the wall, one of them holding a video camera, recording the events on the bed. Tim whispered the number of men in their positions to his team, and then counted down from 3. They burst into the room, moving quickly. Tim went straight for the man holding a knife, striking him down instantly. The second man tried to back away but was stopped by a swift cut that left him immobilized and in pain. The Gomez brothers, seeing what had happened, raised their hands in surrender. One of the men by the wall attempted to reach for a gun, but Randy's shotgun took him down before he could react. Chewy confiscated the video camera and ordered the last man to face the wall with his hands up. Tim turned his focus to the man hurting Katie, realizing in horror that she was being strangled by something the man held. The attacker froze as he locked eyes with Tim, and the room fell silent as the rest of the team secured the area. Tim lifted his sword and moved forward. The man quickly let go of the wire and backed away, fear showing in his eyes as he pressed against the headboard. Two other men, who had been hurting the young women, also scrambled back. The closest one tried to reach for a gun hanging on a belt by the bedpost. Ranger Boyd moved toward him, his rifle aimed at the man, and said, "Yeah, go ahead. I'll make sure you regret it." The man dropped to the bed, raising his hands in surrender while Boyd took the pistol from him, keeping his rifle close. Katie lay forward on the pillow. Tim could see she was gone, but he checked her pulse just to be sure. He gently kissed her cheek and covered her with a sheet. He spoke calmly to the two young girls nearby. "Wrap yourselves in the blanket and sit over there in the corner. We'll help you soon, but first, we need to deal with these men. Do you understand?" The girls nodded quickly, grabbed the blankets, and hurried to the corner behind Randy Jackson. Tim's anger, which he had controlled all night, started to rise. The thin man in front of him felt fear and started to talk tough. "Do you know who I am? I'm the Assistant Attorney General of Texas. You're in big trouble." 11 of Tim's crew laughed loudly and Tim grinned darkly. "Do you know who I am? No? Let me tell you, I am justice itself. I am here to make things right. I'm the one you should be afraid of." The assistant attorney's face changed to one of terror as he tried to hide. In a swift move, Tim nicked the man next to him, just enough to draw a drop of blood, causing him to cry. On the other side, Boyd pulled his man off the bed by his hair. As soon as the man hit the floor, Boyd kicked him in the stomach. The man bent over and Boyd pushed his head down. Boyd then kicked him again, lifting him off the ground. The man cried out and struggled. Boyd stepped on his head, pressing it into the ground. He turned to the crew. "This is the man who let Tim's wife and kids down. His name is Terry Jones. And that man on the bed is Deputy Don Long, who was supposed to protect them." He pointed with his rifle. "Which of you knows where the other deputy is?" Silence fell as neither man spoke. Tim nodded at Chivo, who walked over and flicked his wrist, showing he meant business. The scream caught in Jones's throat as Boyd's boot pressed hard against his cheek. Chivo moved around the bed toward Deputy Long, who quickly raised his hand in a desperate attempt to stop him. "Wait, it wasn't me. Long shot him because he wouldn't go along with the plan. We dumped his body in a creek near Taylor. He was my friend, but Long did it, not me." Tim cut in sharply. "But you stood by and let it happen, didn't you? You're Long's partner in this whole kidnapping, aren't you? And now you're the one hurting this young woman. Gentlemen, let's take a vote." In unison, the team cast their verdict. Guilty. Tim nodded to Will and Guillermo, two members from New Braunfels. "Find out what else he knows," Tim ordered, "then carry out his sentence." Chivo grinned, ready for the task, knowing his role in the battle ahead. The deputy was dragged from the room. his muffled cries echoing down the stairs, but they fell silent within minutes. Meanwhile, Randy stood guard over the cameraman as Tim, Daniel, Chuy, and Jesse formed a semicircle around the Gomez brothers. Despite their reputation as cartel leaders, the Gomez brothers looked terrified. Andres had even soiled himself, leaving a mess on the floor as they pressed against the glass wall, desperate. Manuel, the older brother, tried to negotiate, offering them large sums of money in exchange for their freedom. Chuy stepped forward, flicked his knife, and calmly cut a piece of Manuel's skin. His scream filled the room, but when it quieted, Chuy said, "You won't get off easily, but you might survive. That depends on how angry El Rey de los Ratones is. Teo, what's your call?" Tim didn't hesitate. "Take them downstairs to Chivo. He'll be done with the other ones soon. Tell him to make sure they remember every life they've destroyed, every girl they've trafficked, every crime they've committed." Tim's voice grew cold. "And remind them of his niece. He can carve her name into them if he feels like it." Tim paused for a moment, then added with a small grin, "Before you take them downstairs, tell them what happened to the men they sent before and what's coming for their families. Let them know their empire is done, and their relatives won't survive the week." Turning to the Gomez brothers, Tim spoke again, his voice harsh. "If you have any last words, now's the time, cabrones." Both brothers began pleading frantically, begging Tim to spare their families, insisting that their relatives were innocent. Tim's smile returned, darker this time. "My sons were innocent. Did that stop you from taking them? Did it stop you from planning to kill them? Did your innocence stop you from kidnapping and selling countless young women into slavery? My wife was innocent, yet you had her harmed. So no, cabrones, you and your families will face the consequences of your actions." Tim looked at the Gomez brothers, then spoke coldly. "Many people will pay the price, though not as many as those you hurt, those you drugged, sold, or worse. Your legacy will be one of pain, and no one will be left to remember you or mourn your passing. Your line ends here." He motioned toward the door. "Take them away and make sure they pay for everything they've done." The brothers, who once carried themselves as powerful criminals, now whimpered and begged as they were led away, a stark contrast to their former reputations as cartel leaders. Tim chuckled darkly. "The devil's angels? More like cowards who preyed on the weak. By the time they're finished, they'll regret every choice that led them here." Turning his attention to the man lying injured on the floor, Tim gave more orders. "Miguel, Jose, take him downstairs. Find out what he knows. Don't let him go until we have every bit of information we need. We need to understand his role in this mess." Randy stood guard as Tim approached another man who was still facing the wall, his hands raised in surrender. "Randy, keep an eye on the one on the bed. If he tries anything, stop him, but leave him for me." Tim moved closer to the man at the wall, his voice calm but filled with menace. "You've got until I count down from 10 to tell us who you are, what role you play in all of this, and why we shouldn't make you regret your silence. Start talking before I reach 0. 9, 8. The man, trembling, broke down before Tim finished counting. "I'm Adam Ballard, General Spieth's Chief of Staff. I know the names of officials, lawmakers, law enforcement who've been part of this. I can show you where the recordings are, everything. Please, I'll tell you everything." Tim glanced at Ranger Boyd and Deputy Jackson, who were stunned by the information. "Looks like we hit the jackpot. Randy, take Mr. Ballard downstairs. Get him a drink, sit him at the table, and record everything he says. If he starts holding back, remind him why that's a bad idea." Then, turning to the women who had been caught up in this nightmare, Tim gave a softer order. "Deputy Jackson, help them find clothes and make them comfortable. Randy, once they're settled, put them in a room where they can rest, but don't let them leave until we've talked to them." Finally, Tim gave his last instructions. "As for the others, keep them quiet and make sure they understand there's no escaping what's coming. They can have water and use the bathroom, but they don't get to feel safe, not yet." Tim addressed the group, his voice firm but measured. "I haven't decided what's next for everyone. Girls, you've seen how serious we are. Don't make the mistake of thinking we'll go easy just because of what you've been through. If you try to leave without permission, we won't hesitate to act. Once we're done here, we'll talk about what happens next. Any questions?" Jackson stood nearby with the girls, who were no longer crying, though they clung to each other. The rifle stayed trained on Adams, ensuring no sudden moves. After a moment, one of the girls, a tall brunette, gathered her courage and spoke. "Coach Kelly," she began, her voice steady. "We recognized you, even with all the dirt and paint on your face. I'm Sharon from your advanced physics class. This is my friend Jana. She doesn't have you as a teacher." She took a breath before continuing. "We want to tell you what happened and how we ended up here." Sharon explained how they had left the Dairy Queen and were on their way home when a car forced them off the road. "It was Coaches Rogers and Slaughter," she said, her voice trembling. "We screamed, but they tied us up and threw us in the trunk of their car." She recounted how they were taken to an old house on a dirt road. "They warned us that no one could hear our screams and that how badly we were treated depended on how we followed orders." She paused, glancing at Jana for support. "Coach, we're good girls. We never thought something like this could happen to us." Sharon's voice wavered as she described the terrible things that followed. "We were taken by those men. It was awful. Then they brought us here, and it happened all over again. But when we saw Mrs. Kelly fighting back as hard as she could, it gave us strength, and we tried to fight too." Sharon's voice broke when she spoke about Tim's wife. "The men threatened to hurt your sons if she didn't cooperate. She stopped fighting then. She told her boys she loved them and to be good for you when you came to get them." Tears filled her eyes as she recalled the scene. "Your sons were crying, begging them not to hurt their mom." Sharon struggled to continue. "They made her lie still while they hurt her. She couldn't fight anymore. We heard her gasping and then it was quiet." Sharon and Jana were both in tears by now. "We're so sorry, Coach. We tried to fight, but—" Tim cut her off gently. "No, don't blame yourselves. None of this is your fault. These men are responsible for everything, and they will pay for it tonight." He paused, glancing at Randy. "Go with Randy now. I need a moment with the skinny man." His voice was quiet but firm as he turned away, ready to face the man who had caused so much pain. "I will talk to you later. Randy, please use the VCR downstairs to make at least 2 copies of the tape and look for anything else important that we don't want destroyed or getting into the wrong hands." Tim, Randy, and Jim knew the girls would never be the same, and they felt sorry for what had happened to them. However, keeping the girls safe was a risk. Still, they were innocent and needed protection. The challenge was how to keep them safe without getting into trouble. "Where do you want to question your traitor?" Tim asked Ranger Boyd. "I'd rather do it somewhere with tools. I'm not good with knives and swords, but I can use tools like hammers and pliers. I saw some in the garage, so I'll find some help and take him out there." "You understand that after what we just saw and heard, I plan to take my time," Jim said with a sneer. "This guy isn't going to enjoy what he did. Send Will, Guillermo, and someone else if you can spare them, just not Chivo. He has enough on his plate." Assistant Attorney General Spieth continued to whimper on the bed, only a few feet from Karen's body. Tim moved closer and put the sword against his back, making a long but shallow cut. Blood came out, and Spieth yelped in pain and fear. He lost control right there. Tim laughed at his fear. Will, Guillermo, and Jesse soon entered the room. "Help him relax a bit, but don't hurt him too badly. I'm taking Karen into another room." He wrapped a sheet around her and lifted her up, carrying her out of the room as he had done on their wedding night. His emotions were strong, but he pushed them down and told Karen, "I'm so sorry, my love. I hope you are with God in heaven. I need to deal with those who hurt you before I can really grieve. You died a hero, protecting our boys the best you could. If only I had known to come sooner to save you." He gently closed her eyes. "I will always love you, Karen. I'm so sorry you suffered, but know that those who caused you pain are gone now. They all faced their own suffering. Know that Spieth and those who betrayed you will also pay for their actions, and Spieth will meet the end last of all, welcoming his own fate. You will never see them again, because none of them will be in heaven with you." Tim knelt beside her, his heart heavy with grief. "I hope one day I can find enough redemption to be with you again," he whispered. "That depends on the Lord's forgiveness for what I've done and what I'm about to do. Maybe you can speak on my behalf." His voice broke as he added, "I've loved you since the moment we met. Rest now, my angel." He gently swept her hair back, framing her face. Despite everything, she looked peaceful. Tim kissed her forehead and covered her face, his sorrow turning into a deep, burning anger as he stood. Justice needed to be served. He walked back to the master bedroom, his mind focused on confronting the man responsible. Inside, Spieth was face down, pinned under Will, who was holding his head down in a pillow. Wayne and Jesse were restraining him by his feet, which were nailed to the floor. Spieth's muffled cries filled the room as he begged for mercy, but no one was listening. Wayne stepped aside when Tim entered. "His hands are tied as you instructed. What now?" "Lift him up and put the large pillow under him," Tim ordered, his voice calm but filled with purpose. Once Spieth was restrained, Tim took a wooden tool and slowly forced it against him, causing Spieth to scream in pain. His attempts to escape were futile. Tim's anger burned brighter as he asked, "How many women and girls have you hurt like this?" Spieth cried out again, but Tim ignored his pleas. He continued with the punishment, drawing a parallel between what Spieth had done to others and what was happening now. Eventually, Spieth passed out from the pain, but Wayne revived him with cold water. Tim then placed a clear plastic bag over Spieth's head, sealing it tightly. They watched as Spieth struggled for air, nearing the point of suffocation. Tim cut a small hole in the bag at the last moment, allowing him to gasp for breath, only to repeat the process moments later. Tim leaned down, his voice low but firm. "Do you want to live or at least die quickly? We can keep this up all night. Are you ready to talk?" Spieth, desperate and terrified, nodded frantically. "Your chief of staff has already told us about the tapes and files," Tim said. "But maybe you can still tell us something useful if you want any chance of easing your suffering." Spieth's desperation showed in his voice as he blurted, "Yes! I have a box of photos evidence of rich and powerful people, including politicians involved with underage girls and boys, local, state, and even national figures. I can get them for you, just don't kill me." Tim, calm but firm, replied, "Then show some good faith. Give us the exact location and explain how you plan to retrieve them." Spieth shook his head, panic rising. "No! If I tell you, I know you'll kill me. But I'll take you there." Tim's tone remained steady. "In less than 30 minutes, you'll have given us maps and keys. For all your bravado, you're just a coward. If you don't cooperate, the pain you're about to feel will make everything up to now seem mild. Give us what we need and it'll stop." It didn't take 30 minutes. The mere sound of the drill was enough to break him. Before long, they had the exact location of the evidence and everything they needed. His life ended in disgrace. And though Tim had the answers, he still felt unsatisfied. There were more people responsible, more wrongs to right, and the drive for justice remained strong within him. Downstairs, Tim found a disturbing scene. One of the women involved in the operation was dead, and the other was barely alive as Chivo worked to help her. "They were more involved than we thought," Miguel explained. "Turns out they were recruiters for Spieth and Landon. They befriended and lured young girls, drugged them, and handed them over before they were sold to Gomez and sent around the world. After seeing Chivo at work, they gave us everything more information than we could ever use in court," Miguel continued. "We've uncovered names of some of the missing kids, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. We've probably solved most of the missing persons cases involving young people in Texas over the past several years. We also know where the tapes and files are, and Adam's list of those involved will shake up politics in this state for years. But with so many people in power tied to this, we'll need to be careful about how we proceed." Miguel paused, then asked, "Did Spieth give you anything more?" Tim nodded, but his expression was dark. "Yes, but I'm not ready to share it just yet. Jesse has the tape, and you can review it when you need to. Just know this goes deeper than any of us realized, and it's been going on for a long time. Spieth kept his power because he had leverage on everyone." Miguel nodded, understanding. "What about the girls?" Tim was directed to the guest bedroom where he sat with the two young girls for a while, speaking gently with them, trying to offer comfort. After about 15 minutes, he stepped out and quietly spoke with Daniel Sr. The plan was moving forward, and there was still much to do. Tim took his wife, Karen, down the hill to the lake dock. He carefully placed her on the seat of a boat. After saying a quiet goodbye, he pushed the boat into the water, turned it around, and let it drift toward a quiet beach across the lake, about a half-mile away. Once he said a final prayer for Karen, he walked back up the hill and met the others a short distance down the road. While the boys slept peacefully, Nate and Tim guided the girls over 2 hills into a deep ravine behind the second hill. The girls made a small camp with blankets against the stone cliff on one side and sat quietly, holding the sleeping boys close. Nate reminded them about the plan and how to talk to the police and firefighters who would come first. Tim gently kissed each of his sons and the girls. He asked them to review their plan, and they did it just as he wanted. Nate praised the girls for their bravery and hoped for a chance to meet them in happier times. The other men waited on the road in their cars. Nate and Tim got ready, and they drove away. About 30 minutes later, they arrived in the small town of Bee Cave, where Tim got out and used a payphone to make a call. As they turned their vehicles north, they saw a large fire in the distance and heard police sirens. They watched as the local fire department rushed to respond and parked their trucks just down the road. The men said a quick prayer and drove back to the ranch near Dripping Springs. Later, Nate and Tim sat at Tim's house in Cedar Park, watching the morning news on TV. The reporters showed footage of a house that had been destroyed by a fire and an explosion near Lake Travis. A fire investigator spoke, saying they wouldn't know anything until the fire cooled down. It seemed like there had been a gas explosion, but there was no mention of survivors, which worried the brothers since the girls and their sons should have been mentioned. At 7 a.m., Tim called the sheriff's office in Karen's hometown, but they had no updates. He called the local police, and they told him the same. Tim wanted to call Jeannie, and Nate wanted to call Linda, but they knew they had to wait to avoid any monitored calls. Finally, their anxious waiting came to an end just after 9:30. A detective from the Austin Police Department said that Tim's sons were at Brackenridge Medical Center. He reassured Tim that the boys were okay physically, but were feeling very upset. They were with a social worker and a child psychologist for help. The detective asked Tim to come to the medical center right away. Tim agreed but wanted to know where their mother was. The detective replied he only had information about Tim's sons. Nate drove quickly along US 183, even making experienced drivers nervous on the busy road. Although there were no accidents, he navigated around slower cars, sometimes going off the road or around red lights. They made the 20-mile trip in just 20 minutes. Nate dropped Tim off at the emergency entrance before looking for a parking spot. Tim hurried inside to the desk, gave his name, and someone made a call. A police officer in plain clothes came over, introduced himself as Detective Cox, and asked Tim to follow him. Nate arrived as they were leaving the emergency room. Tim introduced him as his brother, and they were soon taken to the children's floor. The detective knocked on the door of a room where the boys were. A woman with red hair in a suit opened the door and waved them in. Patrick and Mark were sitting with an older woman in scrubs, listening to a story. When Patrick heard the door, he quickly turned around, jumped up, and shouted, "Daddy!" He rushed over to Tim. Mark looked confused at first, but then smiled and ran to Tim, crying, "Daddy! Daddy! Daddy!" Tim embraced both of his boys, tears of joy streaming down his face as they kissed him and hugged him tightly. Nate stood back with the detective and the woman, both smiling widely as Tim spun his boys around and returned their kisses. The heartwarming reunion lasted several minutes until little Mark gently held Tim's face in his hands and said seriously, "Daddy, bad men came and took us away from Granny and Gramps. We drove a long way and then they took us from Mommy." Patrick added, "Daddy, they put us in a big room and Mommy was crying. The bad men were hurting her and she was crying. They said they would hurt us too, but Mommy begged them to leave us alone. They took us outside, but Mommy told us she loved us and to behave for you when you came to get us. I hate those mean men." Mark turned Tim's face back to him and said, "Mommy said she loved us to the moon, but she was crying. Daddy, you need to find those bad men and bring Mommy back." Tears filled the eyes of everyone in the room, but Tim fought to stay calm for his boys. He said, "There are many people looking for Mommy right now, boys. We need to take you home and wait for them to bring her back. We'll call Granny and Gramps and we can go see them after the men find Mommy," Tim reassured his boys, trying to keep them calm. Turning to the detective, Tim asked, "Have you found her?" The detective shook his head, replying, "I'll tell you everything we know in a few minutes. Right now, focus on your sons." Confused, Tim asked, "How did you find my sons but not my wife?" They should have been together. The detective explained, "Your sons were found with two young women hiding in a ditch near a house fire by Lake Travis. I'll give you all the details when we talk later. Right now, just take care of your boys. There's a phone you can use to call their grandparents or anyone else you need to. Is it okay if I speak with your brother while you're with the boys?" Tim nodded. "Sure. But please, if you hear anything about Karen, let me know immediately. Before you go, who are the girls they were with?" The detective provided their names, asking if Tim recognized them. Tim replied that he knew both. They were students at the high school where he taught. One was in his second period physics class, and he knew they were involved in dance and track. But they had never babysat his sons, so he couldn't understand why they were with the boys. The detective assured him that they'd explain everything later. After spending more time comforting his sons, Tim asked a woman in scrubs who was nearby if she could stay and read to the boys while he made some calls. She agreed, and the boys settled into their chairs as she began reading to them. Tim first called his parents, letting them know the boys were safe and asking them to inform Linda, Daniel, and Dora. Then he called Karen's parents, sharing the relief that the boys were okay, but also the distressing news that Karen was still missing. He asked them to stay home in case Karen tried to contact them. Next, Tim called Andy. "I've learned that my boys are safe, but Karen's still missing," he said. "The girls they were with are students I know, but I don't understand why they had the boys with them. They're going to need legal help. There are things here that may look suspicious, especially with the explosion." "Don't worry," Andy replied. "Both girls have legal representation. Jana's dad is a friend, and I reached out to offer support when the girls disappeared. He called me as soon as they were found. We're meeting with law enforcement this afternoon at 3:30. I'm also representing Sharon." Tim felt some relief, knowing the girls were getting help. After his calls, he sat down with his sons, who quickly fell asleep in his lap, clearly exhausted. The woman in scrubs introduced herself softly, explaining that she was a doctor specializing in helping children who had been through traumatic events. She said she was assigned to his sons and offered to stay with the boys while he spoke to the police officer. Tim was taken to a conference room on the ground floor. Inside, he found Detective Cox, his brother, and two Texas Rangers talking quietly. They stopped when he entered, and the detective asked him to sit at the table. Jim Boyd was one of the Rangers and introduced the other as his leader, Chief Alley. The serious tone of Chief Alley's voice matched the concerned looks on the faces of the officers and Tim's brother. "Mr. Kelly, we have some sad news. We found a body on a boat across the lake from a house that exploded last night. We believe it may be your wife. We will need you to identify the body, but your brother has tentatively identified her as the woman in this photo. Can you take a look?" Tim entered the room filled with emotions he had kept inside. The photograph of Care broke that floodgate, and he cried deeply and openly for several minutes. No one spoke or tried to comfort him, but they all felt his pain. Once he calmed down, Tim dried his eyes, looked at the chief, and confirmed, "That is Care. Karen, my wife. I'm sorry for my outburst. We had some problems in the past few months. Many hurtful things were said and done, and now we will never have the chance to resolve them. I loved her deeply from the moment I met her, and now—" Tears fell from Tim's eyes again, but he lowered his head and stared at the table, not wanting to cry more over something he could not change. Boyd left, leaving Nate and Tim alone in the conference room. Nate placed his hand on Tim's arm and said, "I know those tears were real. Regardless of recent events, she was a remarkable woman, a great wife, and an amazing mother. We all make mistakes. Unfortunately, hers was a big one, and now you have two wonderful children to raise on your own. No one knows how things will turn out with Jeannie, but you know Linda and I are here for you, no matter what." "I know," Tim replied, "and that makes it easier. Those boys will need every bit of family they have left. As you said, she was a wonderful mother." Karen's parents arrived an hour later. The boys were asleep, and Tim was grateful for that when he had to tell them that Karen's body had been found. They were both devastated, and her mother needed calming medication from the psychiatrist assigned to her grandsons. While she was settling down, Tim went to the morgue to identify the remains, leaving Nate with the parents. He knew what to expect, but it broke his heart all over again. He wished he could confront those responsible for the pain they had caused. He remembered how Spieth had begged to be free before he was taken away, but if he had the chance again, he would have kept him around a bit longer. His only hope for getting back at those responsible rested on what Boyd might find when they looked over the film and recordings. He was eager for that moment. The investigator from the Travis Sheriff's Department who was looking into her case asked to speak with him, and he agreed without hesitation. The questions were not very surprising. They showed him just how little they understood, and the investigator did not learn anything from him. However, Tim found out that they had discovered the van with the severed fingers on a road near Pleasanton. They had identified Larry, Slaughter, and Benton by their fingerprints, and were working to identify others. Tim went back to the hospital, signed the necessary paperwork, and agreed for his sons to see a counselor for a while to help them cope with the trauma and the loss of their mother. The boys were awake, talking and playing with their grandparents, while Nate, the psychiatrist, and the counselor were there too. Tim sat with one boy on each knee and gently shared the news with them. He told them that Mommy was in heaven with God and the angels, and that she was happy and looking down on them. He assured them she would always be there if they needed her. Mark cried softly, letting his tears soak into Daddy's shoulder while Patrick got angry. "It was those mean men, right, Daddy? They were hurting her. I yelled at them, but they wouldn't stop. I want to find them and make them pay for what they did to Mommy." "I want that too, Patrick, but the police will find those men and they will face consequences," Tim promised him. "No! 2 policemen were the ones who took us. They hurt another police officer and brought us to the place where they hurt Mommy. I don't like policemen," Patrick shouted. Tim held them both close. "Patrick and Mark, most police officers are good, but sometimes there are a few that are not. Those 2 are bad. But remember, Ranger Jim is a good one, right?" Patrick nodded, then began to cry again. "I love Mommy. I want her here with us, not in heaven. We need her." The next hour was incredibly tough. Both boys cried, their grandparents cried, the psychiatrist and counselor shed tears, and Nate and Tim found themselves crying too, as they tried to comfort everyone. Eventually, everyone's emotions wore them out. Tim took the boys home in Nate's pickup truck, while Nate followed with their grandparents, who were still too upset to drive. Once they were all settled, Nate went to pick up pizza and spaghetti from Mr. Gaddy's. Granny and Grandpa took the boys outside to play on their swing set. Tim called his parents and asked them to share the news with everyone down south. They mentioned that Linda had already informed them, and that they were ready to come up whenever Tim wanted. He asked them to wait until he called again the next day. Next, he called Andy, but there was no answer, so he decided to call the Housemans. Jimmy told Tim that Andy was meeting with 2 girls, their parents, and the investigator in charge of their case. He also mentioned that Jim Boyd had gotten permission to search the AG's office, and he was there with a fellow ranger he trusted. Jimmy asked if Tim would stay at his house and promised to keep him updated when he had more information. Tim hesitated, knowing that the next call could be very important if not handled well. He decided to call anyway. Jeannie answered the phone after 2 rings. Tim paused before speaking formally. "Jeannie, this is Tim. I wanted to say I'm very sorry about your husband's passing." Jeannie took a moment before replying, "Thank you, Tim. I heard that Karen has also passed. I'm really sorry about that too. I know you and your sons must be heartbroken. Can I do anything to help?" As Tim listened to her voice, he wished he could be with her for support. He needed her kindness and comfort at that moment. But he couldn't do that, so he thanked her for her offer, invited her to reach out if she needed, and mentioned that he hoped to express his condolences in person soon. She asked about funeral plans, and he explained it was too early since they needed to conduct an autopsy first before releasing her body. Tim then asked about Larry. Jeannie told him his parents would hold a memorial in Chicago for family, but nothing was said in Texas yet since his body hadn't been found. They agreed to keep each other posted and ended the call. They said nothing to suggest anything was wrong, but the conversation felt incomplete. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, waking Nate and Karen's parents. The boys were already playing in the living room. While they weren't sad, they seemed less cheerful than usual. A breakfast of eggs, bacon, biscuits, milk, and coffee, along with friendly chat, helped start the day on a good note. After sending the boys outside to play, Granny asked Tim to call and see if there were any updates. He nodded and picked up the phone. His first call was to the coroner, who said the body would likely be released the next day. The second call was to the sheriff's department investigator, who had no new information. His third call came from Jim Boyd. He asked Tim when he could be interviewed, and Tim replied that it should be in a neutral place. Boyd suggested the Houseman house in an hour. After telling his in-laws he needed to meet with the Texas Rangers looking into their daughter's death, Tim and Nate headed to Northwest Austin. The meeting took place around the dining room table at the Houseman's house, with Boyd and Terry across from Tim and Nate. Jimmy, Patty, and Andy sat at the ends of the table listening closely. Boyd let Ranger Terry take the lead, and he began to ask the usual questions that law enforcement often asks during an investigation. Tim answered quickly and confidently, showing that he had nothing to hide. Terry felt reassured that Tim was being honest. Some questions were asked of Nate, but he pretended not to know anything beyond what Tim had shared. Ranger Terry left at 4:30, saying he needed to be at his daughter's cheerleading tryouts at 6. Once Terry was gone, Boyd checked the room for any hidden devices while the others talked, and then he rejoined them. "Nate is also your client, right?" Boyd asked the lawyers. Nate took out 3 $20 bills and handed one to each of them. They confirmed that he was indeed their client. "Great. Tim and Nate, let's keep this conversation focused," Boyd said. They both nodded, and Boyd went on. "Based on what we learned from Andy's clients, Ranger Terry and I carried out a search at the offices of a state official. What we discovered was very worrying, to say the least. I can't share the specifics, but we copied some important documents and gave the originals to a trusted friend at the FBI. We kept the copies in different locations because we're unsure how the agents will handle the evidence. We know that many influential people are involved, and they will do whatever it takes to prevent this from coming to light. There might be negotiations, some people may step down, and others might escape consequences, or they may face serious charges. Ranger Terry and I will be prepared at all times, so I suggest you do the same, Tim. Your name is linked to this situation, so be careful. Now, can I have a few minutes alone with the brothers? I promise it won't be an interrogation." The lawyers left the room, closing the door behind them. "Tim, did you ever watch the videos you got from Rogers's house?" Boyd asked. "Most of them, not all," Tim replied. "Why do you ask?" "We need to watch them now, if you still have them. This situation began long before Karen and involves many more people. It reaches the highest levels of the state and even into federal matters, with some well-known names from sports, entertainment, and business involved. If any of them are in those tapes, we need to find out," Boyd urged. "Can we trust the 3 lawyers, or should we find a different place?" Tim assured him that they had already gone through many of the videos and could be trusted. The earlier lightheartedness faded as they entered the den. Now, serious. Jimmy took out the videos from his safe, and they looked at the titles for clues about the content. 2 unlabeled tapes were wrapped together and seemed unused, but Tim noticed one looked partially used, so they prepared to watch it. Both tapes were T200 recorded in LP format, which meant they could run for over 400 minutes each. After watching for an hour, they realized that the events they saw were very connected. To figure out who was involved, they needed to watch everything closely. One thing was clear. Spieth's claim that wealthy and famous people were heavily involved was true. Tim and Boyd wanted to return to their families, so they asked the Housemans to make 3 copies of the recordings. They wanted to keep the originals safe and provide a copy to Tim and Jim. The Housemans agreed and said they would store the copies in their safe until everyone could watch them together later. "Before you go, Sharon, Jana, and their parents want me to keep you updated. Patty, can we use your office?" 30 minutes later, they were heading home, happy that the girls' meeting with the sheriff's investigators went as well as they had hoped. The house was lively when Nate and Tim arrived. The boys were busy entertaining Tim's parents, his sister Jan, and her husband Gary, along with Nate's wife Linda. Karen's parents were cooking hamburgers, while Grandpa Paul managed the grill and Granny Beth prepared the sides. Tim and his family had received condolences before arriving, and there were many hugs, especially from his mother, with a few tears shed. Linda gave him a warm hug, told him she loved him and his boys, and reminded him to look out for each other. After dinner and cleaning up, everyone gathered in the living room to watch the boys play and talk. Their grandmothers helped them get ready for bed at 7:30, and their dad read them a story until they fell asleep. Tim was about to join the adults again when the phone rang. He answered it in the kitchen and was surprised to hear, "Hey, Primo, great to hear from you. It's been ages." Tim stepped back and signaled for Nate to come over. "Good evening, Cousin Martin. How are you?" Nate perked up when he heard the name, and Tim held the phone so Nate could listen. "I'm well, Time Tio, unlike many of your friends and foes. Texas can be a dangerous place, can't it?" "For some, yes. For others, not so much," Tim replied. "I'm very sorry to hear about your wonderful wife," Martin said sadly. "She was a lovely person and a great mother. I know I don't need to remind you, but we had nothing to do with what happened, even if some people tried to suggest otherwise. Those bad guys indeed needed to be stopped, but I haven't heard the official story, but it seems like something went wrong with a drug deal. I never thought of you and your group, though. I figured you were at your place in Mexico by Lago Azucar, right?" "Yes, I was, and our local contacts weren't involved either. But we're friends. You know I would never hurt your wife or your kids." "I know, cousin, just like I would never hurt yours," Tim replied quickly. They both understood that their words were a bit uncertain, but it was important to say because Martin was about to propose something. "I guess the people who caused the trouble at the lake and those who left behind some clues thought using names from some local gangsters would confuse the police. Do you think they thought we would be found guilty even though we were innocent and had solid alibis? There are some well-connected folks in Texas who know who is involved and who has proof to show they weren't. I've heard the details don't match up. Some evidence points to one group of troublemakers and some to another. It seems the police are confused about the clues, but they aren't searching too hard because those people were already wanted. The reports say the clues were from people who have passed, confirming they are gone. I don't know much about what happened at the lake, but it looks like they are just trying to identify the remains. You have no idea, do you?" "I don't know, but I can check if you want me to," Martin replied. "I understand you, cousin. You want to find out who harmed your wife, your kids, and the other girls mentioned in the news. Do you need my help?" "Please, Cousin Martin, I do want to know, and I might need assistance when I find out," Tim explained. "For my cousin Teo, anything I can do, for free," Martin said cheerfully. "Good. Let me know if you find out more, please," Tim asked. Nate shook his head in amazement as they returned to the living room where everyone was quiet. Their dad, John Michael, asked, "What was that about?" "An unexpected call," Tim answered, "from Cousin Martin. He shared his condolences and offered to help in any way he could." "I thought I heard you calling him Cousin Martin. Who is he?" Karen's dad asked. "He's not really a cousin. In South Texas and northern Mexico, calling someone Primo is a way to treat them like family, even if they're not related. I met him back when I was in college. He helped us with some problems then. He offered to help again, and I asked him to tell me if he hears anything important. He's a well-known figure in Mexico and has influence in Texas, so who knows? Maybe he can assist again," Tim explained. Linda, Nate, Tim, and their dad were drinking coffee in the living room, talking quietly and watching the early news with the volume low, when Tim suddenly sat up straight and turned the volume up a little. A replay of the Attorney General's update on the fire presented last night just before the 10 o'clock news was showing. He praised the good work done by AAG Spieth, calling him a man of character and courage, and promised to bring justice for those who harmed him. Tim looked at Nate, confused. "Is this how they plan to handle this? That doesn't make sense. They have the tape, they know what really happened. Enough of this, I'm done. It's time to take serious action." Tim left the shocked group in the living room and went to call Jim Boyd from the kitchen. "Good morning. I've been waiting for your call since last night, Tim. Before you get started, can you meet me for breakfast at that spot we both like? We need to talk," Jim said. Tim agreed and got ready. "I have a meeting with the ranger in charge of the investigation. I'll be back in an hour or I'll call you," Tim said, choosing a longer route to ensure he wasn't followed, as Jim suggested on the phone. Boyd sat in the last booth at the back with 2 cups of coffee. Tim began to speak, but the ranger interrupted him. "Listen first, then I'll listen to you, okay?" Tim nodded, and Boyd continued, "Many of the important people are at risk and they are all coming together. I'm not sure what I can do. Do you have any ideas?" "I do. Tim replied, "Because I saw this coming. Want to hear it, or would you rather not know?" "Let's hear the plan," Boyd said. Tim nodded, checking to make sure no one was watching. He shared his idea with the ranger. "I have a friend from college who is making a name for herself in television news. She's passionate, hardworking, and she believes strongly in our rights. She will chase a story no matter what. She's also very clever, and she gets really upset with arrogance and misuse of power. I plan to share some video and audio with her, help her gain an audience, and then give her even more." "When is the AG going to speak again?" Tim asked. "Not until Thursday at 11 unless we give him something sooner," Boyd replied. "Don't do that," Tim urged. "That will work perfectly. She'll be in Austin for the press conference, I promise. Will other law enforcement be there with him? Will you be?" "Yes and no. I'm second in charge in case they need a scapegoat, but I'm being told what I can say and do. I'm not important enough to be on stage with them." "Well, that's good. You've got about 75 hours to find a safe place," Tim warned. The AG confidently took the microphone and gave his update. He was joined by the DPS chief, the Law and Order Lieutenant Governor, and several strong supporters of strict law enforcement. He concluded his speech by once again praising AAG Spieth and opened the floor to questions from a few reporters. At first, AG West handled the easy questions from the reporters smoothly, but then Carol Ann fired off a series of tough questions. AG West became more nervous as Carol Ann, a smart and attractive woman, continued with her well-researched inquiries. The men behind him seemed to shrink back. He tried to bluster and claimed her questions were misleading, but other journalists showed they were also informed. He received no support. By the time his PR person pulled him off the stage, saying he had other appointments, it was clear he was in deep trouble. As he left the stage, the lieutenant governor confronted West and instructed him and the others to come to his office for a meeting. Unfortunately for the lieutenant governor, by the time he walked to his office, his wife was on the phone, angrily discussing a video she had seen. He could barely make sense of what she said, but he caught her last words. "How could you? You have daughters that age." He hung up the phone, looked at the group of men, and ignoring his female secretary said, "We are in big trouble." With that conversation, the focus of the meeting shifted from trying to discredit Carol Ann to saving what they could, their careers, their power, and their families. That same day, altered videos appeared on the Houston station where Carol Ann worked. The videos showed young girls and older men, and it became clear who was involved. AAG Spieth, AG West, Lieutenant Governor Daniels, and several legislative leaders. A few days later, business leaders, a senator, and 3 congressional representatives were publicly linked to the scandal. The whole country buzzed with news from Texas, yet many, including feminist and religious leaders, demanded accountability from those involved. As the days went by, some of the religious leaders stepped back from the situation when their own names were revealed in various reports. One prominent feminist leader left the country just before a major event. Moving vans filled with belongings were seen in the neighborhoods in West Austin known for housing the wealthy, and the best divorce lawyers became busy. The governor kept a low profile, stating he would let the system handle the issue before taking any action. By the end of the second week, he seemed a bit more relaxed. But then he found Tim sitting at his dining table with his wife, who looked very upset. Although the governor's video was never aired, news of his resignation to return to his law practice came out 2 days later. One of his last official actions was to appoint Jim Boyd as the director of the Department of Public Safety. This was following the passing of the previous director, who sadly died by his own hand shortly after a video was released. Karen was laid to rest in her hometown, next to her beloved grandmother. Tim delivered a moving speech, honoring her as a teacher, a wife, and a mother who made a great sacrifice for her sons. He understood that most people there were aware of how she had died from news reports, and that many knew about her actions over the previous months. However, he chose not to mention these details, instead sharing many examples of her kindness. As he prepared to finish and return to his seat, he paused, thought about what to say next, and looked at the audience. "Before I conclude, I would like to share a story. Take from it what you will. I will call this story Too Magnificent." There was a rancher in South Texas who took great care of the animals and wildlife on his ranch. He ensured the wildlife was well fed, even during the hot, dry summer months, providing grain for the quail and extra food for the deer all year round when it was needed. The animals thrived, and within 5 years he had the healthiest deer herd in brush country. One young buck particularly caught his attention, and he watched over him as he grew. At age 5, the buck had a stunning rack with 14 points and measured over 36 inches wide. He led the herd, mating with does and passing on his impressive traits to the fawns. When the buck reached age 6, he had 16 points, and the rancher believed he would break records for typical bucks, with 8 points on each side. Word spread as locals praised the buck to wealthy hunters who approached the rancher one after another, eager to pay any amount to hunt the trophy. He politely turned them down, knowing that the young buck would continue to mate and pass on his great genes for many years. The wealthy hunters did not give up, which frustrated them since they were used to getting what they wanted. There were also other threats, such as road hunters who roamed the roads near his ranch. The buck learned to stay away from the road after witnessing other young bucks get harmed, and the number of road hunters diminished when their night shots were met with responses. This led law enforcement to question their activity on the road at such late hours, and the road hunting eventually stopped. In the end, the buck's exceptional qualities became too much for a powerful man, who paid individuals to breach the ranch's fence and take the trophy while the rancher was away on vacation with his wife. The magnificent head was removed, and the trophy was added to his collection. The rancher kept searching for the outlaws who had harmed his land and convinced them to reveal who had paid them to harm his prized possession. The wealthy man was arrested, and the head of the animal was returned to the rancher. He cried over the loss of what could have been a bright future for this creature and its offspring. However, the wealthy man's attorneys got the charges dropped, and he went back to his old ways. In the end, however, fate caught up with him. He was accidentally shot while hunting near the ranch where he had taken the animal. This story teaches us many lessons. One important lesson is that there can be too much beauty in a world where rich hunters have so much influence. We need to be more like the rancher. We need to stay aware and not bow down to the rich and powerful, many of whom became wealthy through unfair or dishonest methods. We should not look up to those who have gained wealth and power through questionable actions. Instead, we should be cautious and challenge their endless greed. There are indeed good men and women who are wealthy but use their resources to help others, not to harm them. They are not trophy hunters. When the rich use their wealth to gain even more at the cost of hard-working people, when they buy political influence or positions, that is not true democracy. That is an unfair rule by the wealthy, and we need to stand up against it and not let them betray our democratic values. They buy positions or influences and create laws that benefit only themselves, which harms everyone else. We must not allow these unfair individuals to control our community and country by manipulating our votes or the representatives we choose. My wife's legacy should be that we, the people, take back control of our government. We must never elect those who ruled our state with harshness until they were exposed. Keep this in mind when voting in the upcoming elections to fill the seats of those who were forced to step down when revealed, and think about it again in the fall when we can change the course of our state and nation. Karen will be deeply missed by her family and friends. Whether her brave actions were in vain will be determined by the choices we make together in the future. May Karen be blessed. May we receive guidance in our journey. Thank you for being here. There was complete silence as Tim took his seat. Jeannie looked out the passenger window of her dad's SUV, watching the landscape pass by as they headed east to I-35 and then north to San Antonio. She seemed relaxed, but her face was serious, her body still, and her eyes focused. "A penny for your thoughts," her dad said. "I doubt they are different from yours, Daddy," she replied. Concern for Tim's boys and wife, worry for Tim and those who are with him, and anger at those who caused this. "Does that sound right?" she said without looking away. "Pretty much. We just need to add a lot of prayer and we are close to the truth. You know he has to do this, right, honey?" "I know, Dad. After hearing what happened and then his children and Karen being taken away, he believes he can't trust anyone else. I understand that, but it doesn't make it easier, does it?" The car grew quiet as the lights of San Antonio brightened and the ranch faded away. Jeannie leaned back in her seat, resting her feet on the dashboard. The memory of what happened during the intense moments of danger came back to her. How could she have so easily ended the life of someone she once loved? At that time, it felt like the right choice. It was either her or him. Now, doubts and other thoughts filled her mind. You really didn't have a choice, baby. He was coming for you with bad intentions. Yes, he was your husband, but he lost that title when he started hurting you and lying to you. If you hadn't acted, he would have harmed Tim, maybe even me, and taken you away. Don't let doubts weigh you down. You had to act. She understood that, but hearing her father say it helped. She turned her thoughts back to Tim and his difficult journey. The possibilities were so daunting she found it hard to fully think about them, but she forced herself to focus. He could succeed, rescue his wife and children, and bring them to safety. If he did, would he go back to Karen? That thought pained her, as she realized she loved him. He might save his family, but get caught by those in power who wouldn't allow the truth to get out. He could find his family in a bad situation, take action against those to blame, and end up facing serious consequences, dismissed by the corrupt leaders in charge. He could even lose his life trying. The only happy ending she could imagine was that he safely brings his family back, divorces Karen, marries her, and they find happiness together. It made her smile for a moment, but the chances felt slim. Once home, Joe parked in the garage, closed the doors, stepped out with a weapon in hand, and motioned for her to follow him. Emilia and Kathy were waiting just inside. They embraced and exchanged warm greetings. Joe turned to his younger daughter, held her arms gently but firmly, and asked, "Did you notice the checkpoints as we got closer to the neighborhood, Jeannie? Did you see that quick movement in the trees as we got closer to the house?" She looked puzzled and shook her head. "Those are my people. But what if they aren't? I really dislike that we are in this situation, but you need to stay alert. Your safety and ours might depend on it. We don't know who they are or what they know, but they do know you are Larry's wife and there's a threat against you. What happened in Texas doesn't change that. You are still in serious danger, and so are your family and anyone with you. The threat didn't disappear because some of them are gone. If anything, the danger has increased. Your mom and sister could be at risk too, as we assume those in charge still want you for their own reasons. I'm sorry to put more stress on you, but you can't afford to get lost in regret and fear right now. We need the strong Jeannie from the ranch, not our fragile princess." Jeannie hugged her dad tightly and cried. Her mother and sister joined in and held her close, comforting her while her dad stroked her hair and told her to let it all out. She would need to be strong today and in the days ahead. She was surprised by how many tears she had, but after a few minutes of crying, she felt an unusual sense of relief and calm. Her mom and Kathy had stopped crying and were just holding her tight. Finally, she released her dad, stood up straight, and said, "Thank you, my dear family, I really needed that. I guess I had to let it out to face everything that has happened recently and the uncertainty of what's to come. Mom, Kathy, let's gather around the kitchen table so we can talk more." It took more than an hour for Jeannie and Joe to share the full story and explain their current situation. There were moments when Kathy gasped, and times when her mother closed her eyes, struggling to take in the weight of their experiences. Hearing about Joe's past in Vietnam was one thing. Having her daughter involved in such dangerous events was something different entirely. All four of them had tears in their eyes at times, but they accepted that some things must be faced head-on. While the talk was still fresh, Joe showed Jeannie where he kept some items in the house for protection and suggested she keep a small one with her. He gave similar items to his wife and older daughter along with the same advice, and then they worked out a plan to defend themselves if there was ever a threat. Joe reminded all three of his daughters that their safety should always come first. "Can you believe it? 6 weeks ago, I was married to Larry and had no clue about everything happening around me," Jeannie said, shaking her head in disbelief. "I must have been totally unaware, and I regret not leaving the first time he hurt me, not even 6 months after we tied the knot. Looking back, I wanted him to be someone he wasn't. I ignored the bad parts, focused only on the good, and held on so tightly that it's no wonder he didn't respect me. Sweetheart, I think part of the issue comes from how your dad and I raised you. You were always so happy, bright, and loved by everyone in school. We didn't prepare you for the tough times or for people like Larry. It was a hard lesson to learn, but now you've faced it and moved on. All you can do is learn from that and keep going. Am I making the same mistake with Tim? He seems perfect in my eyes. Am I missing something with him, just like I did with Larry? I hope I'm not, because I've never felt this strongly about anyone before. But I think I need to hear what others think. Kathy shook her head. Alan thinks he's a great guy, and I feel like he really likes you. Amelia reached across the table to hold her youngest daughter's hand. Honey, I don't know Tim well, but I see things in him that I never saw in Larry. We hoped Larry would become a good husband and someday a good dad, but he just didn't change. He seemed more focused on controlling you than building a strong relationship. We worried so much about you and about him. I don't see those same issues with Tim, but Joe knows him better. What do you think, Joe? Never compare your ex-husband to Tim, Jeannie. They are completely different. As your mother said, Larry was not what he seemed. He showed no real values, character, or courage. Tim has plenty of all three, maybe even too much. I've seen you two together, and there's definitely a strong connection between you. He paused to smile and laugh at his blushing daughter, who seemed to remember that connection. Still, I'll advise you again like I did before. Take it slow. He chuckled again. Or at least try to. When you two are together, it's like a whirlwind that sweeps everyone up. I should have kept you apart, but it's hard to ignore how you feel when you're around each other. Well, that's all in the past. Now let's hope Tim and his team succeed, and then we can move forward. Honestly, I don't know what the future looks like for you or for Tim, who is caught in a storm he didn't cause. I understand that you both care for each other, but sometimes love alone isn't enough. So, I realize we are talking about things we can't control. How would you feel about going to the chapel to pray for help and for good to win over bad tonight? Father Jose saw them in the chapel and noticed their shared mood. He went into the confessional, turned on the light to show someone was there even if it wasn't the right time, and waited. First came Amelia, then Kathy. Their confessions worried him a bit, but they were not unusual for a priest in San Antonio. However, the confessions of Joe and then sweet Jeannie, whom he had seen grow up and married in this church, were of a seriousness he hadn't faced since his time in Rwanda in the early 1970s. There was no single prayer he could give them to cleanse their hearts, so he advised them to pray often and sincerely, prayer without stopping. After they left, he prayed for them repeatedly. He wished he could have told them to promise never to do those things again, but if they hadn't acted, good men might have been lost, and Jeannie could have been in a bad situation. He had seen the effects of evil when good does not fight back, and he couldn't blame good people for defending against darkness. Years before, Amelia had convinced Joe to build a screen-it-in chapel and dining area near his barbecue pit and outdoor kitchen. The back wall of the chapel was decorated with crosses and crucifixes, and a statue of Mary looked down from a high platform. As night came, Joe asked if they would like him to grill steaks and vegetables and eat in the chapel. They thought it was a wonderful idea, especially when he brought out his boombox and played lively gospel and praise music. They enjoyed a cheerful family conversation to keep Jeannie's mind off the worries of the rescue mission, which seemed to help her a bit, even if the tension was clear in her and her father. She ate less than anyone else, but nibbled on her food and chatted with them. After dinner, Kathy started cleaning up the paper plates and plastic utensils, while Joe tidied the grill. Amelia opened the storage door under the tiled serving shelf, which also served as an altar, and pulled out 4 kneeling pads. After placing the items on the shelf, she took a decorative box from the cabinet. Turning back to her daughters, she gave each of them a rosary and said, "Maybe this is a good time to say the rosary. Say 3 Hail Marys and ask Mother Mary to help us." Instead of talking, Jeannie took the beads, set a pad in front of the altar, looked up at the statue of Mary, and knelt to pray. The others quickly joined her. With soft music playing in the background, they recited the rosary, followed by 3 Hail Marys. Jeannie stayed there, eyes closed, silently praying for the safety of those being rescued and the rescuers. Eventually, Amelia encouraged her to sit with them at the table, hold hands, and keep praying. They stayed in the chapel until the phone on the back porch rang sometime after 3 a.m. Joe rushed to the porch to answer the phone, and the others hurried back to stand behind him. Not a problem, Ranger. I was having trouble sleeping anyway. He paused, listening for several minutes before giving a short, uneasy laugh. Thanks for the update, Jim, even if you sound a bit tipsy. I would have rather been out there fishing with you, but work kept me busy. I'm glad you had a good night and caught some good fish without anyone falling in. Maybe we can plan a fish fry when things settle down. Now, everyone should put the drinks away and get some sleep. You never know what tomorrow will bring. See you later. He turned back to his daughter with a big smile and said, If I got the message right, and I think I did, they rescued the kids. They are safe, and no one on the team was hurt. Jeannie relaxed with relief, and Kathy hugged her tightly. Joe added, Jim was a bit hard to understand. He mentioned they were all a bit tipsy and suggested I stay up to watch the early news, just like they planned, because there were whispers about something big happening on Lake Travis. I think he said that to be cautious, but I believe we need to make some coffee and watch the morning news starting at 4:30. The coffee tasted good and smelled even better, but the 4:30 news was quiet. Just after the 5 o'clock segment began, there was a breaking news interruption. The morning anchor reported a serious explosion and fire at a house on Lake Travis. He said the building had collapsed and the fire was still raging. A gas leak filling the basement before exploding was suspected because the destruction was so severe and the flames so fierce. There was no mention of survivors or casualties, so they waited anxiously for more information. At 8:30, Jeannie received a phone call from the DPS. After saying sorry for calling so early and for the sad news he had to share, the official told her they had confirmed her husband's death through a fingerprint from a severed finger. She asked how they knew he was dead instead of hurt. He explained that the evidence showed he had already passed away when the finger was taken. He mentioned that they hadn't found any other remains yet, but a search was taking place near Pleasanton, where the finger was discovered. She knew the actual remains were 75 miles away, buried under a large pile of red sand, and that the body might never be found. This thought made her heart ache with sorrow. After pouring herself another cup of coffee, she gathered her courage and called his parents in Chicago. They were heartbroken over the loss of their son. His mother made it clear they were upset with Jeannie, blaming her for leaving him. Taking a deep breath, she shared her sadness and recalled some happy memories they had shared, especially from Christmas. When they talked about planning a memorial service once the body was found, the conversation became awkward, and his mother began to cry again. Jeannie wished them well, saying they could talk later when they knew more, and then hung up. She thought to herself, They blame me for leaving him. If only they understood. Tears filled her eyes again. Some of her tears were for her husband, but many were for the grief she felt, knowing she was part of the pain that affected his parents. Feeling worn out, Jeannie fell asleep on the couch. Her mom tucked her in, and she and Kathy went upstairs to rest. Joe went to his dealership to check on things, but returned a couple of hours later to join the others in sleep. Around 12:30, the phone rang. Amelia answered it and then went into Kathy's room to wake her up and hand her the phone. After about 10 minutes, she went to the living room and nudged Jeannie awake. Jeannie, Alan called. He said Tim's boys were found safe in the brush near the fireside along with 2 high school students. Tim is going to the morgue to identify his wife's remains. She was found on a boat across the lake from the fire. Jeannie shed tears of joy for Tim and his sons, but also tears of sadness for Karen. Whatever had happened, she did not deserve to go like that. A few hours later, Tim called. His voice was distant and formal as he shared his sorrow over Larry's passing and offered his condolences. Jeannie put on her formal voice to respond, expressing her sadness for the loss he and his sons were facing. She offered to help him, but he thanked her and said no. Then he offered to help her, and she kindly said no as well. She understood they couldn't be together right now, but she had never needed anyone as much as she needed Tim at this moment. This made her sad. The Hildebrands had a late lunch, which was actually early dinner, eating canned chicken noodle soup and crackers. After watching the evening news, which didn't add anything new to the earlier story, they went to bed. Amelia woke her daughters at 7, urging them to have breakfast tacos before they got cold. Joe had already eaten and left for the dealership. Before he went, he mentioned there was no new news about the house fire on the morning broadcast. The 3 women enjoyed their breakfast, sipping coffee and chatting about light topics that avoided the tough times of the past. By 10:30, they decided to go grocery shopping and maybe visit North Star Mall for some fun shopping. They talked it over and decided to dress a little nicer, wearing sundresses and comfortable shoes. Amelia called the dealership and left a message for Joe about their plans. Just as they were leaving the garage, Jeannie remembered something Joe had said. "Mom, Kathy, did you bring your safety devices? I should go back to get mine. Do you want yours too?" Even though they were used to visiting the nearby range, carrying safety devices wasn't something they did every day. Yet. They went to North Star Mall first, since their grocery list included items that needed to stay cool. They found shopping for clothes to be more fun than grocery shopping. After shopping, they had a bag from Foley's and another from Frost Brothers when they stopped at the food court for a snack. They picked up another bag at their next stop, Josky's. Happy and loaded with bags, they left Josky's and walked toward Amelia's car, parked near the large, giant Justin's boot sculpture in the north parking lot. For reasons she couldn't explain, Jeannie noticed a white service van moving slowly in the distance, keeping pace with them. She watched it for a little longer and then called to her mom and sister, pretending she needed to adjust her bags. They joked with her until they saw her serious expression. Jeannie turned her back to the van and signaled for them to look behind her. "Don't stare, but look over my shoulder. See that white van? It's been slowly following us toward the car. I'm not sure if we're in any danger, but let's go back inside the mall and call Dad just to be safe. If they turn around or come back when we go to the mall, drop your things and run." She laughed and pointed towards the mall as she walked that way, with her mother and sister following her. As soon as they turned around, the van backed up and sped to block their path to the mall. They dropped their bags and started running, but it quickly became clear they were too far away from safety. Jeannie led her family behind a large pickup truck. They crouched down, with Kathy peeking over the hood. "It stopped, and 3 men jumped out. They're coming towards us and moving between the cars." Jeannie took charge. "Mom, go to the front and take the one on the right. Kathy, you can see over the hood, so take the one in the middle. I'll go behind the truck and take the one on the left. Wait until they come out to shoot." The men seemed determined to catch them as they ran. Each had a weapon, but they were not pointed toward the women. The man on the right reached them first, and Amelia fired. A moment later, Kathy fired too. The gunman on the left shot at the pickup, breaking the glass but not hitting anyone. Jeannie shot him in the chest, and when he didn't fall, she shot him again. The van kept moving toward the mall, but then turned onto the same row where the women were. When it saw the women shooting, it speeded toward them. Jeannie moved to the back corner of the truck to get a shot at the driver while Amelia and Kathy faced the van, ready to shoot. Jeannie noticed that the man her mom shot was trying to grab his weapon lying a few steps away. She shot him in the shoulder and yelled that if he moved again, she would stop him. A man leaned out of the passenger window of the van with a rifle. "Shoot the driver!" Jeannie yelled, firing twice at the passenger with the rifle. She heard more shots, and the van swerved off, hitting the back of a nearby car. It was quiet for a moment, and then a man jumped from the sliding door of the van with a gun, shooting at their pickup. When he stopped and began to run, Jeannie steadied herself and fired twice, hitting him in the back as he fell to the ground. Mall security and a police car arrived quickly. The women stayed crouched behind the truck, cautious in case there were more threats nearby. The police asked everyone to come out with their hands up, but Amelia shouted, "We won't come out until you check the van and the injured men near us. They shot at us and tried to take us away. We don't know if it's safe yet." More police cars arrived, surrounding the area. No one pushed them to leave the truck, but a sergeant warned them through a speaker that they needed to put down their guns for officers to check the van and the people on the ground. They put their guns down and raised their hands, but stayed behind the truck. 2 officers quickly went to the van. One looked at the man lying in the street, groaning in pain, while 2 others checked the men next to the women. Then they asked Jeannie, Kathy, and Amelia to come out from behind the truck, and they did, with their hands raised. The women were held at the police station for over 3 hours while officers sorted through information from other law enforcement and from the survivors. Joe and his lawyer arrived quickly after being called, but not much was asked of the women during the first 2 hours. Things changed after the police found out that the men were part of a local gang. They listed the crimes the gang members had committed that day and the punishments they could face for trying to kidnap the women. When they suggested they might reduce the charges if they cooperated, the gang leader Darius admitted they were contacted by a man offering them $20,000 each for Amelia, Kathy, and Jeannie. He didn't know the man's name, but they were given a phone number to call once they had the women. That's when the FBI got involved. The FBI, informed of related events, first questioned Jeannie about an attempted break-in at the Housemans, about the abuse claims she made against Larry, and about his recent passing. She kept her story straight, and her family supported her. When Joe threatened to have Jeannie stop cooperating and bring in his lawyer, the FBI decided it was better to find out who hired the gang. The San Antonio police and the FBI planned together. They had Darius call the number and claim they had the three women. They were told to take them to a warehouse on the southwest side, off US 90, near Kelly Air Force Base. To prepare for a possible ransom request, 2 agents went with Joe back to his business to set up a recorder for any incoming calls. No one, not even Jeannie or her family, thought the attempted kidnapping was for money. Everyone believed it was connected to the earlier threats from her husband and the reward for capturing her, but they felt they had to take the risk. Joe and the agents stopped at the car dealership's waiting room for coffee and some sweetbread from a nearby bakery. They were enjoying their snack when the receptionist handed Joe a call. "Joe Hildebrand, how can I help you?" he answered. A voice on the other end was somewhat hard to hear. "We have your family, Joe Hildebrand. We were going to take them out of the country and sell them to the highest bidder. Your wife will bring a good price because of her age, but your daughters, they will bring in even more." "What do you mean you have them? I just spoke to them hours ago and they were at the mall. You must be joking," Joe responded. "But you haven't heard from them since, and you won't unless you follow our orders." "I still think you're joking, but what do you want?" "First, you need to bring us $100,000 for each woman. When you give us the money, you tell us where Tim Kelly is. Our men are all over the state, and once we confirm where he is, we will let you and the women go. If you call the police, we'll hurt you and sell the women. Do you understand?" "I understand, but I need proof that you have my family. Let me speak to one of them." "They are in another room. I will show them to you when you arrive in 1 hour. If you're not here by then, say goodbye to them." "Do you really think I have $300,000 just sitting in my office? I'll need time to gather that money." "You have 1 hour. I will call back then. If not, goodbye." The agents contacted the phone company and quickly alerted their superiors. The police had already arranged another service van to replace the one that was stolen, and the SWAT team was ready. Their plan was to go straight to the warehouse, wait for the doors to open, and then go inside. An armored truck would be nearby and ready to help if needed. But there was one big problem. The call for ransom came from the local office of a state senator. Joe and the agents stayed in his office while the SWAT team headed toward the warehouse after 40 minutes. They planned to enter only after receiving a second call. Another team went to the senator's office, watching to see if another call would come from there. It did, exactly 60 minutes later. The SWAT team arrived at the building just 2 minutes after receiving the call, capturing 5 more members of the local gang without firing a single shot. The senator and 3 other men were in his office when the police rushed in, ready for anything. He was still on the phone with Joe, making plans when everything he thought was safe changed in an instant. Joe and Jim Boyd decided not to tell Tim about the kidnapping attempt, knowing he would get too involved. Tim eventually found out through the news, but by that time, everything had been resolved. They were able to convince him it was all over. He was not happy about not being informed, but he accepted how things turned out. In the days that followed, the Hildebrands watched the state government fall apart on TV, with rich businessmen, preachers, and even some women being implicated in various scandals. They knew where the information came from, but they kept quiet, not wanting to draw attention to themselves. They attended Karen's funeral, which was delayed due to an investigation. It took place in her hometown, and they sat toward the back with Jim Boyd and his wife, the Housemans, Alan, Chet, Jennifer, Randy Jackson, and many of Karen and Tim's friends. Tim's remarks about Karen moved everyone to tears. After the service, they gathered outside before going to the gravesite. Alan led them in, remembering Karen, and asked them to join him in a moment of silent prayer for her. Jeannie prayed passionately, promising to care for her children if the opportunity arose. After a brief graveside service, the Reverend invited everyone to the American Legion Hall to celebrate Karen's life and her work with school children. The hall was filled with her mementos and photos, including a large framed picture of her with her sons and husband, all smiling together. This only made the reason for their gathering more heartbreaking. The little boys stayed brave throughout the day, but they showed their emotions when Laura and Will hugged them. They lost their composure completely when Patty and Jeannie knelt before them with open arms. They jumped into their embrace, cried hard, and found comfort in their hugs. This brought the line to a stop. Tim suggested that the Reverend lead a prayer, and then everyone could get a plate of food. They would try to see everyone before leaving. He turned away and quietly cried for a moment before pulling himself together and drying his eyes with his coat sleeve. When he turned back, he saw the women standing with the boys in their arms, talking to the grandparents. Chet put an arm around Tim's shoulders, while Will hugged him tightly. "I can't believe this, Tim," Will said, his voice thick with feeling. "And I can't believe what they did either," Jim Boyd added softly, standing in front of Tim. "I can almost hear their cries. I wish I could make it worse for those who are still here. I promise you, buddy, I will find a way." "I wish I could bring them back just to make them pay again, but in a slower and more painful way," Tim said fiercely. They all shared a hug, feeling a bit awkward afterward. Meanwhile, the crowd was focused on Patty, who was holding Mark, and Jeannie, who was holding Patrick as they chose food for their plates. Tim knew he had to talk to Karen's parents about what had happened, but he felt confident that the story was innocent enough. Still, he wanted them to think well of Jeannie and Patty, so he planned to explain things carefully. Tim joined his sons at the table and nibbled at his food, but the emotions of the day had worn him out, and he had little appetite. Jim, the Housemans, Chet, Alan, and the Hildebrands were very attentive to Karen's family. Tim's parents, Linda and Nate, along with Jan and Gary, worked hard to keep them engaged, providing a small break from the sadness they had all felt for weeks. It seemed to help, as they didn't eat much but managed to smile a few times during dinner. While he was away, the board offered Tim the position of head football coach and athletics director, giving him a month to decide. Part of him wanted to move on, but in the end, he accepted the job. He decided to sell their home and find a place closer to the school. He realized he couldn't escape Karen's memory, especially since the only other member from their poker group, John Allen, had moved away after a tough divorce. Selling the house would take time, but he couldn't bear to stay there surrounded by memories. So, Tim rented a nice older home with a big yard. It was already furnished, as the elderly couple who had lived there recently moved in with their daughter in Dallas due to health issues. Tim changed the mattresses but kept the other furniture. The boys felt a bit sad about not being at home, but they quickly adjusted since it was a new experience. Although both returned to work in late April, Jeannie and Tim decided to keep their relationship friendly and casual out of respect for Karen. Jeannie felt sad for Tim and his boys, knowing they needed time to grieve. She also needed time and support to heal from the difficult events at the ranch. Knowing she wouldn't return to their home, she put the house up for sale and moved into an apartment. When school ended in mid-May, Tim took the boys to visit their maternal grandparents for a week, and then to see his parents for another week. He worried about discussing Karen's passing, but it turned out Karen had already shared everything, and she had been truthful. Tim mentioned that the boys had grown close to Patty and Jeannie while staying with the Housemans before the incident. The grandparents knew this because the boys had told them. Tim's father-in-law finally stopped him and said, "Tim, you were a wonderful husband to our daughter. You're a great father to our grandchildren and a good son-in-law. We understand you need to move forward. Just help the boys remember their mother and let us stay in their lives." Tim smiled and asked, "Can children ever have too many grandparents?" He agreed they could not, promising to always honor Karen in front of her boys and to include the grandparents in their lives. After school ended and Jeannie returned to San Antonio, Tim started calling her every few days. Their conversations remained friendly, not romantic. They were both hurting and hesitant to move forward. Larry's family decided to hold a celebration of his life in Chicago on Memorial Day weekend, but Jeannie and her parents were not invited. They had their own remembrance, focused on the happy moments from the past. She expressed her sadness and prayed for Larry. It was a tough night for her, and she returned to her counselor on Tuesday to discuss the struggle of loving someone who causes pain and the need to protect oneself. On the second Wednesday in June, Tim called and had the boys ask Jeannie if she would like to join them for a week at the coast. She happily replied that she would love to go and asked when they were leaving. The boys celebrated cheerfully until Tim returned and asked if she would be willing to drive down to the ranch the next day. It would be a chance to visit his family and meet her new friends for a couple of days before heading to Port Arkansas. She got there just in time for lunch with Tim's family on Thursday. They spent the afternoon together exploring the town, and she met more of his friends and family. On Friday, she enjoyed the morning with Tim, Patrick, and Mark as they visited more local sites. They had a delicious lunch with his family, and then went swimming at the city pool. Even with a modest swimsuit, Jeannie attracted quite a bit of attention from the other parents watching their kids. That evening, the 4 adults played games with the kids and helped them get ready for bed at 8. It was a relaxed and fulfilling day. On Saturday, they visited the local museum, which had exhibits about pioneer families, including Tim's family history. Saturday night, she joined Los Ratones and their spouses for a casual dinner at the ranch. This time, it was a potluck where each woman insisted on giving Jeannie a little bit of her special dish, making sure she tried everything. Theodora stepped in with a friendly warning that the food might be a bit too much for her, which came after Jeannie had already eaten quite a lot and was trying to cool down with iced tea. She felt very full and worried about how she would feel later. There were no alcoholic drinks served that night, as this was not a celebration but a gathering to celebrate their good fortune in being safe and together. Sheriff Miguel stood up and held his glass of tea high, thanking everyone for their support and the safe gathering. Then Tim shared his heartfelt gratitude and love for everyone, but became too emotional to continue and sat down. There was a moment of silence, but Jeannie spoke up to thank them for welcoming her into their group. She also laughed and expressed her appreciation for the Mexican dances they had taught her and the delicious food. Her words lightened the mood, and soon the joyful atmosphere returned. They all returned to Tim's parents' home after midnight. He kissed her softly before they headed to their separate rooms, rekindling the connection they shared. The next morning, Nate and Linda joined them for breakfast, and then they all rode out to the ranch while the grandparents watched the boys. There was a sense of unease because of what had happened the last time they were here. However, it seemed only ranching activities had taken place since then. Nate didn't show Tim the old graves, saying people wouldn't understand if he had. After checking on the cattle and horses, they stopped by the ranch house. There were no signs of anything unusual there either. Linda brought sandwiches, chips, and drinks, and they spent several hours eating and talking, allowing the tension to fade away. By the time they left, laughter came easily as Nate shared stories about night noises and shadows, reminding everyone that even Joe found humor in it. Jeannie got playful and smiled at Tim before leaving. When they took the ferry across the channel, they were excited to see porpoises jumping in the water. The boys cheered loudly. As they neared the dock, they hopped back in the truck, chatting eagerly to Jeannie about the porpoises, eagles, and swimming in the ocean while being careful of jellyfish and sharks. Their rental was a house among 3 others, set on tall wooden piers just off the beach. A narrow sandy road led to the houses, which were raised high above the dunes and shared a parking space in the middle. Tim picked the smaller house with 2 bedrooms in front. The larger houses were empty until Wednesday when Jeannie, Tim's parents, and their siblings would join them for the week. The bigger bedroom had a king bed and a bathroom, while the smaller bedroom had a queen bed and a nearby bathroom. Tim and the boys planned to stay in the larger bedroom while Jeannie would be in the smaller one. They applied sunscreen on the boys, made them wear beach hats, and set up a shaded area for their food, drinks, toys, and chairs. Then they went to the beach, splashing in the waves and searching for shells, forgetting about the sunscreen for a moment. Fortunately, Jeannie remembered and insisted they all put on more sunscreen and hats before they started building sandcastles. Tim was good at making moats, but but Jeannie's skills were impressive, shaping and decorating the castles beautifully. This left Tim to fetch sand and water for their creations. They ended the day with hamburgers and shakes from a nearby stand, enjoying the view of ships, planes, and the stars as the moon rose over the water. Mark fell asleep in Jeannie's lap, and Patrick dozed off on Tim's lap. When it was time to put them to bed, Mark clung to Jeannie and said, "I want to sleep with Mommy," sounding sleepy and cozy. Tim shook his head but smiled. Jeannie had tears in her eyes but managed to smile. The line between them felt uncertain. On Tuesday, they tried fishing off the beach. Dad handled the bait and casting while Jeannie helped by holding the fishing rods. It was more challenging than they thought, so they moved to a wharf where they used bobbers to fish. It didn't matter what small fish they caught. It was still an exciting adventure filled with laughter and cheers. Since they had not caught anything, they stopped at the seafood market to buy fish and shrimp for dinner, and they got hot dogs for lunch, along with a half-gallon of frozen custard for dessert. Their naps were longer than usual, giving Jeannie and Tim more time to chat and share some light teasing. Jeannie wore a conservative one-piece swimsuit, but Tim was impressed by the stylish mélo she had on that afternoon. She found ways to show off, which made Tim even more intrigued. They played in the waves and then went searching for shells and sand dollars along the beach. The boys were curious about the noise coming from a group of college students they passed, but Dad explained they were just having fun. A little way down the beach, Tim fell behind. He let out a playful whistle and shouted, "Yay!" just like the boys had. Jeannie smirked as Patrick and Mark looked at him curiously. He pointed to a perfect sand dollar he had found. The boys rushed over to add it to their collection, and Tim exchanged playful glances with Jeannie, who responded with a wink. On their way back, the boys held Jeannie's hands while Tim carried their treasures, some driftwood, and the beach bag he always brought along. Two older couples near the water stopped them, and one woman said, "We saw you walking by earlier and wanted to say that you are a beautiful family." Tim thanked them, but Jeannie seemed lost in thought and didn't say much, while the boys smiled proudly at the compliment. After enjoying stuffed flounder and boiled shrimp for dinner, they watched the sunset. The lights on the oil rigs and ships lit up, and the stars began to appear. The moon shone brightly in the sky. They all cuddled up on the rocking love seat, and soon the boys fell asleep. When Tim tried to move them to the big bed, they both wanted Jeannie with them. So, Tim brought her nightgown and changed rooms with her. Jeannie lay between the boys, holding them close, and quietly shed a few tears. Tim went to bed surprised at how easily his boys had accepted her as part of their family. It was almost time to make the call. The Kelly family arrived in 2 cars at 10, followed by the Hildebrands and Alan at 10:30. Alan and Kathy were sitting closely together in the back seat, and it was clear their relationship was growing stronger. Once everyone had their beach gear on, Tim asked Nate, Linda, Jan, and Gary to take Jeannie and the boys to the beach, set up, and he and the parents would join them shortly. They looked a little confused, but agreed without hesitation. "I asked you to stay because I need some advice. Jeannie and the boys are getting close much faster than I expected. Mark called her mommy on Monday night, and both boys slept with her last night. I know that may sound okay, but I don't want Karen's parents to be caught off guard by this. How would it be to invite them down to stay in your extra bedroom, Joe and Amelia? If they see how well the boys connect with Jeannie, maybe it would help. What do you all think?" There was some discussion back and forth among them before they agreed. Tim's mother suggested that she and Amelia should be the ones to invite Karen's parents, and they quickly accepted. Jeannie felt surprised when Tim told her, and she was a bit nervous when they arrived later that afternoon. Karen's mother added to the tension at first, but after a few hours her jealousy faded as she grew fond of her grandsons and accepted how much they cared for Jeannie. Sharing meals, spending time at the beach, souvenir shopping, taking pictures, walking together and looking at the stars brought everyone closer. The boys thrived in this environment of love and support. The 3 younger couples decided to go to a club on Saturday night. They enjoyed some drinks and danced. Nate, Gary, and Tim had to be on guard against some college boys who were being too forward, but they managed to keep things friendly. The compliments from the strangers made the girls feel appreciated. Nate and Gary were eager to return home as they had plans for the night. Tim was busy making plans during the ride back. When they arrived, he grabbed a couple of towels, his car keys, and Jeannie, and headed down the beach to a quieter spot he knew. Jeannie moved closer to him and asked, "Where are we headed?" "Somewhere private," he replied. "But we have the whole house to ourselves. The boys are staying with their grandparents tonight, remember?" she reminded him. "Yes, but with what I have in mind, I think everyone would be awake sooner than later," he said earnestly. "What? I don't. Oh, really? Ha! You have quite the confidence, don't you? I'm not like that." They started around 1. By 2, the air mattresses were flat, and the nearby house, which had been dark when they arrived, was now lit up. She was upset with him about how he treated her. They were dressed and sitting in the pickup, watching the waves shine in the moonlight when the deputy drove up and jokingly asked if they had heard any strange noises. They hadn't, and he casually said they might feel safer a mile down the road where there were no houses to report noises. They thanked him. He went north while they continued south and decided to go for a swim in the cool, misty moonlight. Campers 2 miles away thought they heard a mountain lion around 3, but zipped up their tents and tried to sleep. Tim thought their earlier encounter was unforgettable, but tonight's was something much bigger. Jeannie felt like she had learned so much about herself and was so tired that she couldn't walk, so he helped her into the pickup. He carried her inside, helped her clean up, dried her off, and took her to bed. He placed her nightdress on a chair next to the bed, but let her rest in the bed. He wanted to make sure she was truly lovely, not just glowing from the moonlight at the beach. In the morning light, he looked closer and saw her feet and toes were cute. Her legs and waist were nicely shaped, and her skin was incredibly soft. She had a small waist that curved beautifully, and he noticed everything about her was just right. Her shoulders and neck were graceful, and her hair framed a pretty face that seemed perfect in its own way. Overall, he thought she was beautiful, with a lovely figure that impressed him greatly. The best part was how she responded. That truly made her special. He thought that if they ever got married, he would make sure their house had the best soundproofing. He also wanted to get her some soft items for quiet moments so their kids could rest at night. Their group included a few different types of Protestants and Catholics. They all attended the early service at Trinity by the Sea Episcopal Church and left feeling renewed. After breakfast at a cafe, they finished packing and said their goodbyes. Karen's parents thanked everyone for being part of their lives. Then Granny whispered, "She's a lovely girl, Tim. I can see how much she cares for the boys, and they care for her too. I know Karen would not want you to raise them alone. We hope things go well for both of you. We love you and the boys, and we hope you keep us involved in their lives as they grow. We lost our daughter, but she gave us 2 amazing grandsons and a wonderful son-in-law to love." Tim hugged them both, and the boys did too before they drove away. "What did she say, son?" his mom asked. "She said Jeannie is a wonderful girl who loves her grandchildren and they love her. They hope everything works out for us," Tim replied with bright eyes. Jeannie tilted her head and asked, "Really? They seemed nice, but I thought they might be a bit upset." "Dear, as long as you take good care of Patrick and Mark, they will welcome and support you. And Tim, too. It's clear they care a lot for their 3 boys," Amelia said with a smile. Jeannie pouted adorably, tilted her head the other way, and asked, "What about Tim? Caring for the boys is easy, but their dad can be a handful." Nate, noticing the boys nearby, casually asked, "So, Jeannie, how was the night ride? Did you hear anything strange, like animal sounds? I thought I heard something once, and then a police car went by quickly, so I wondered." As expected, she blushed, making the adults laugh. Tim hugged her, and Patrick, wide-eyed, asked, "Are there really animals out at night at the beach?" "There must be," Nate said with a serious tone. "I'm pretty sure I heard something. It reminded me of what we heard at the ranch. It might even be the same one." "Who would win between an animal and a shark?" Patrick asked excitedly. "If they are both in the water, the shark would win," Nate replied. "But if they are on land, I would bet on the animal, especially this one." "Daddy, is that animal like a big, pretty cat?" Mark asked. "I think our teacher showed us a picture of one if it's a big cat." Nate chimed in. "Yes, Mark, this one is definitely a beautiful kind of big cat. I don't know how risky it is, but it can make loud noises, so maybe it is risky." "That's enough," Linda said, trying to stop her husband and protect her friend from the ongoing laughter. She was laughing just as much as everyone else, and Jeannie, who was leaning against Tim, was smiling and giggling quietly. "Well, now that everyone has teased my dear kitten, I think we should hit the road too," Joe announced. "When are you coming home, kitten?" "Maybe never, Dad. You, Mom, my sister, and Alan are enjoying Nate's silly jokes too much," Jeannie said with a playful frown. "Kitten, before you pout, remember I was at the ranch too." Everyone laughed, and Tim hugged Jeannie to his chest, covering her ear with his hand. She smiled widely, thinking of the fun they had last night at the ranch. Nate picked her up and spun her around, saying, "It's only because I care about you, sis." They all hugged, saying they had to do this again before football season started, and then Jeannie, Tim, and the boys waved goodbye from the top of the dune. "Is there any chance we could stay just one more day?" Jeannie asked with a hopeful look. "Already taken care of," Tim replied. One more day and night at Port Aransas, 3 more days at the ranch, and Jeannie returned to her parents' home in San Antonio. Tim and his sons drove to Austin, where they had rented a house, but he was ready to start looking for something more permanent. The next morning, Tim woke up early, eager to make changes in their life so he could feel secure before focusing on the upcoming football season. He took the boys to the Happy Lions Learning Center, the daycare they had attended the previous year and would go to this year during school hours. Miss Beverly was thrilled to see them, just as they were happy to see her and their friends. After watching the warm greetings and hugs, Tim got serious about finding a stable home. Instead of looking for another realtor or talking to the one he had hired for his house, he decided to ask around. He knew a lot of locals, and they were well informed about the area. He chose to start at the administration building, a place filled with people who loved to chat. He visited the superintendent, who welcomed him warmly. After their chat, he asked the secretary if she knew of any nice, affordable homes for sale near the school. She suggested he contact a builder she knew who was buying and fixing up older properties. Tim knew Daryl Cunningham, so he looked up Daryl's business in the phone book and called him. Daryl was at the office and told Tim he had just the right place for him. They decided to meet in 30 minutes since they were both free. After a friendly greeting, Daryl explained that the house and land he was going to show him used to belong to an older couple who were not well. They sold it to him for a good price and moved to Dallas to be near their daughter. Daryl felt a bit guilty about getting such a great deal, but he was glad the former owners were happy. He started fixing up the house by taking out the old carpets and refinishing the wooden floors downstairs and on the stairs to the second floor. There was still a lot to do, upgrading the electrical and plumbing, repainting the inside, and fixing the roof. The outside walls made of native rock were in excellent condition, and the house was well insulated for its time. The rooms had solid walls and good materials. The trees, shrubs, and lawn were also taken care of, looking nice and healthy. Tim shared that he couldn't buy a house until his own was sold, but Daryl offered to help him with temporary financing for up to 6 months. Tim knew making 2 mortgage payments would be tough, so he called his realtor. She was excited and said she had someone interested in his house and asked if he could meet her there. When the realtor arrived, she brought a young couple with her. She introduced them as her niece and her niece's husband and asked if she could show them around. Tim agreed, but mentioned that the house hadn't been cleaned in over a month. They didn't mind. They loved the house and made a full-price offer right away. Tim had already signed paperwork when he hired the realtor, so they all signed the new documents. The couple wanted to move in 3 weeks from Monday, which meant Tim had to hurry. He called Daryl to let him know he was ready to discuss the offer. When he arrived, Daryl and his son, Dale, who was athletic, were on the roof examining the old cedar shingles. They climbed down, shook hands, and after some small talk about the upcoming sports season, Daryl asked, "Are you sure you don't want to buy this place right now, Coach? I can sell it to you for what I paid plus a little extra for the repairs I've done. Believe me, it's a great price for such a well-built house on 11 shady acres. Honestly, the other 10 acres could be worth at least $1 million someday, and that day might come sooner than you think. Well, Daryl, I hope you don't expect me to pay $1 million. I'm about $750,000 short." Daryl laughed and said, "Coach, I'll take the $250,000 you have if you let me handle the repairs and renovations. To be honest, I'm a bit stretched financially right now, and I have a bigger project in mind. With your money, I can make that happen, and I might even get rich before you do." They spent the next 90 minutes carefully examining the house, with Dale noting down things that needed fixing, or that Tim wanted done. When they finished, Daryl gave Tim a rough estimate that felt doable, and they shook hands on it. Daryl mentioned his teams were busy today and tomorrow, but would send a plumber and electrician to take care of some issues. Since there was no realtor involved, they agreed on a basic sales contract and decided to use a lawyer they trusted who also had a title company. The survey was recent, so the title company should be happy. If there were any problems, they could use the same surveyor at a small cost. Daryl and Dale left, and Tim walked outside to see what he needed to manage the lawn, shrubs, and trees on the land. He wanted to explore all 11 acres, but decided he should wear his boots and jeans for that. So he hopped in his truck, drove to a nearby grocery store, and picked up a 6-pack of beer. When he woke up that morning, he owned one house. 8 hours later, he sold it and bought another one on 11 acres. He wanted to share this news with someone special, and that someone was Jeannie. He returned to his old home, opened a beer, and called her. As he enjoyed a drink, they talked for over an hour despite the long-distance charges. He was happy to pay for it. Hearing her voice made him feel alive. When he arrived, the boys were ready to go. Since it was still early, he took them to see their new house. The thought of a new home got them really excited, and they chattered away, mostly at the same time, all the way there. They loved the big yard and all the trees, but Mark asked why things were messy in the house and why they didn't have any furniture. Daddy explained that their furniture would arrive later after they got some work done on the house, so they were staying in a motel until it was ready. The kids liked the motel because it had a nice swimming pool. The next day, Tim dropped the boys off at daycare at 8, and then spent the morning setting up his utility and phone services for the new house, changing the address for mail, and removing Karen from all the bank accounts. He was in charge of her estate, so he had the death certificate, official letters, and other important papers. There was a lot to take care of, and it felt like too much at times. The life insurance and other policies had paid out. He wanted that money to go to her sons, so he created trust funds of $100,000 for each of them. He also set aside $10,000 in savings accounts for each boy and gave the remaining $80,000 to Danny, a friend in Round Rock who was good with investments. Danny made smart choices that turned out well later. He bought $1,000 each of stocks from companies like Apple and Microsoft, and another $1,000 in shares from Walmart. He also invested in some well-known companies and used the rest of the money to buy real estate near Lake Travis. Tim appreciated Danny's reasoning for each investment so much that he decided to give him $15,000 from his land and cattle savings, telling him to use it wisely. Normally, he would buy more cattle, but 25 years later, this decision helped him earn much more in his teacher retirement. While he was discussing things with the plumbers and electricians, Jeannie arrived in a new 1980 Jeep Grand Wagoneer that her father gave her. The Jeep was striking with its white color and wooden trim, but the workers really took notice when she stepped out. She was wearing sandals and short shorts with a red and white checked top. She seemed to light up the area with her presence. Noticing she had caught their attention, she walked over, kissed Tim on the cheek, greeted the workers, and asked to see the place. She was very impressed by the beautiful woodwork, the banisters, the fireplace, and the spacious living and dining area, as well as the large bedrooms and closets. While she wasn't as impressed with the kitchen layout or the bathrooms, she absolutely loved the yard and the 10 acres of woods around the house. After she shared her thoughts, Tim called Daryl's office and asked him to come by. He arrived right after lunch, and Tim suggested they take another look around, this time with his interior designer. Daryl smiled and said, "Let's go, Miss Jeannie." With wide eyes, she took Tim aside and said, "I didn't mean to start all this extra work, Tim. You asked for my thoughts, and I gave them, but if you like everything as it is, you should keep it that way. This isn't my home." Tim smiled, gently took her arm, and brought her back to Daryl. But before they left, she thought she heard him quietly say, "Not yet." Her heart raced. Jeannie felt that the changes she wanted were made easier by Tim's choice to put on a metal roof instead of replacing the cedar shakes. Daryl had a roofing team available and some extra materials that matched the stone walls of the house. They made a deal that benefited them both. The metal roof would be safer during storms, look nice, and cost less to install and keep up. The plumber and electrician were finishing their work on the original upgrades but had to shift to the new tasks in the bathrooms and kitchen. They took measurements and gave Tim a paper full of drawings and figures. "Let's go pick out appliances," Tim said with a smile. Jeannie looked at him thoughtfully, reminding him that those were just her ideas based on her taste, so he shouldn't feel pressured to replace things he liked. He just smiled and said, "Let's go. I need to grab the boys at 5, and Daryl suggests a store near Austin." Tim was really happy he brought her along. He had no clue about colors or styles, so he encouraged her to talk to the saleswoman. "Okay, but don't say I didn't warn you," she said with a slight frown. She said this as if she thought he cared about what color or style appliances went in the kitchen, which he didn't. She certainly had better taste than he did. The boys were excited to see Jeannie and filled her in on everything that had happened since their last visit. Frustrated by Patrick talking too much, Mark gently turned her face to him and began to share what he had been up to. Tim laughed, but Jeannie managed the lively exchange like a seasoned mom, making sure both boys got their turn. Before they left her Jeep at the new house, she grabbed her small travel case and joined them at the motel. She didn't know what they had planned, but she wanted to be ready for anything. After a nice swim, they dined at a cozy family restaurant nearby before returning to the room to prepare for bed. Jeannie read them Winnie the Pooh, playfully turning the 100-acre wood into the 10-acre woods just like your new house. She tucked them in, gave each a kiss goodnight, and got ready to drive home. Tim wouldn't let her go that late, so she called her mom and stayed over, with Mark in her bed and Patrick in the other. She did receive a sweet goodnight kiss from Tim, which made falling asleep in the same room a little harder. They dropped the boys off at daycare at 9 after breakfast, and some playtime at McDonald's, then went shopping for bathroom fixtures. Jeannie suggested custom tile showers and granite countertops, so they chose toilets, sinks, bathtubs, and faucets for the bathrooms. Tim decided to stop by the nearest Sears. He had a push mower, a weed eater, and other lawn tools, but to keep the big yard and the roadside tidy, he needed a riding mower. He bought a Craftsman 42 inches model and got ramps to put it in the back of his pickup truck. Jeannie didn't get to choose, but it didn't bother her any more than he cared about the kitchen appliances. Over the 2 days, she moved from the passenger seat to sitting next to him in the middle. When he could, he placed his hand on her leg. She felt cozy and was as happy as she could be given the situation. It was too soon to be open about their relationship because they didn't want to create any gossip, but in her mind, they were a couple thinking about their future. Time flew by. She moved into her new apartment with help from Tim and his sons. Coaching school started, and the boys went to stay with Karen's parents for 5 days. The staff was set with people Tim knew and trusted. He kept some of the familiar staff and added 2 great coaches, making coaching school a mix of learning and team bonding. They attended lectures and clinics until lunchtime, then returned to a conference room at the hotel. They enjoyed a catered lunch, and Tim taught them about offensive techniques, sets, and the playbook they would use at all levels, from 7th grade up to varsity. After a break, his defensive coordinator and good friend Bill Owens, who had done very well as a coach, led the staff in learning defensive techniques, sets, schemes, and strategies they would use at every grade level. At 5:30, they went to the hotel bar for drinks, games of pool, and chatting. By the end of coaching school, they all understood the same coaching ideas, how to treat players, and the details of offense and defense. They had become friends, which would help get them through the long and busy high school football season in Texas. Being a single father while also being the head football coach and athletic director was tough. He had discussed this with the superintendent and board members when they offered him the positions. They believed he would manage well, but he had doubts then, and even more as the season got closer. Jeannie also had teaching and dance team responsibilities that kept her busy with practices and games, which made things a bit hard for him. Then people began to help. Miss Beverly offered to take care of the boys until he finished with practice, if he let them come home with her for dinner. Sharon and her sister offered to babysit when needed for away games or other events, and they had a list of other babysitters available as well. Sharon still looked at him with a desire for what they once had, but she understood that he had a new partner now, and her college life was getting more exciting. The grandparents and siblings showed more interest in joining the boys for home games, staying until their dad finished on Saturday afternoon, which eased a lot of pressure. Jeannie did everything she could to be there for the boys and keep them happy. She often picked them up and took them home. She cooked for them and helped them get ready for bed if their dad wasn't there. They grew closer to her. It wasn't perfect, but they made it work. The football season turned out to be the best in 20 years. They only lost one game, a close match decided by a last-minute field goal to the district champions. That loss kept them out of the playoffs, but the champions went on to win the state title. So after the disappointment wore off, they felt proud. With 18 players returning next season, including 9 on both offense and defense, the future looked bright. The junior varsity, sophomore, and freshman teams also performed well, each only losing 2 games, and the junior high teams were undefeated, showing promise for the years ahead. Meanwhile, Jeannie's dance team and the school band did wonderfully at contests and ranked in the top 5 at the state level, which made her feel good too. They had some sleepovers, but there was nothing inappropriate. Jeannie loved the new house, and she joined the boys' campaign for a swimming pool next summer. She playfully told Tim that she had some nice swimsuits he hadn't seen yet, but would if they had a pool surrounded by trees. They tried to keep things discreet, but their connection was clear to everyone. The time they spent together at Tim's house, the exchanged glances at school, and her bond with the boys showed that they were more than just friends. The sweetest moment was when Mark called her Mommy when he got tired at games and rested his head on her shoulder, earning oohs and ahs from nearby fans. It filled Jeannie with such joy that sometimes she felt emotional. No one openly mentioned it, but they were accepted as a couple. Many believed their bond grew from the loss of their spouses, while others knew about the difficult moments they each faced, and they were happy to see them support one another through those hard times. Whenever party invitations were sent out, they received them together and showed up as a pair. Tim tried to keep his true feelings hidden, but when he asked for her hand in marriage in front of her parents on Christmas Eve, no one was surprised, including Jeannie and the boys. He called home to share the news, and Nate commented, "Oh, you're just getting around to that? We thought that was settled months ago." "Oh yes, it's football season." "Well, brother, we have some news for you. You're going to be an uncle." Jan took the phone and added, "And it's true for both of us. Gary and I are having a girl, and so are Nate and Linda. Our trip to Port Aransas worked, so keep next March open." They had a lovely wedding in early June at the shed on the ranch. Many friends came, both from their hometown and from their school 200 miles away. The priest, Father Jose, led a traditional ceremony filled with beautiful words about love and commitment, promising to honor one another through everything. They recited their vows proudly, and their first kiss as a married couple was sweet, filled with joy, even with everyone watching. For their honeymoon, they went to a quiet spot in the Caribbean and came back with sun-kissed skin. 9 months later, they welcomed a baby girl named Jana Marie, and their young boys adored her from the very start. They became her fierce protectors throughout their lives, even as another boy and girl joined their happy family in the years that followed. Tim wanted soundproof walls throughout the house, but he managed to get it for their master bedroom. His wife learned to use pillows to keep things quiet when their kids were home. When they were away, the trees around the house helped muffle noises, but their nearest neighbors always knew when they were alone, and they sometimes used that to entertain themselves. Jeannie got the kitchen and bathrooms she wanted, the boys, and their mom, enjoyed a swimming pool, and Tim installed a high-tech security system that everyone agreed was a smart choice. But that's a whole different story. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe to Infidelity Plus to stay updated with more captivating tales of infidelity and payback. Turn on notifications so you're the first to see our latest content.